Hey guys, tonight we slip back to a misty evening in northern Song, China, where you stand barefoot on cool bamboo floors, heart pounding at what comes next. Who probably won't survive this without wincing. Soft lantern light flickers on your ankles as elders gather, murmuring about beauty and propriety. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. While you settle in, feel free to post your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trace the faint grain of wood beneath your toes, imagining the year is roughly 960 CE, when foot binding first tiptoes into history books during the Song dynasty. A mainstream fact, it's recorded that around the southern Song era, elite families began binding girls' feet to achieve the coveted 3-inch golden lotus shape. Historians still argue whether this practice originated at court among dancing girls or slipped in through wealthy mercantile circles. Some say a legendary concubine named Pan Jinlian staged a dance performance that left spectators enchanted by her tiny, bound feet. In one fringe account, whispered among local storytellers, a famous palace dancer called Yan Yao wrapped her feet so tightly they resembled lotus buds shattered at dawn. Rumor has it her patrons believed the slight click of her shoes on marble floors sounded like falling petals. You can almost hear that delicate tap, until you remember how agonizing the process must have been. That as you settle into your pillow, imagine the wealthy mothers of Song China eyeing their 3-year-old daughters with measured glee. They prepare stout lengths of cloth, usually strips, of course cotton or silk about 10 feet long, dyed in pastel hues that will later peek out from embroidered shoes. A mainstream fact, binding began when a girl was between 4 and 7 years old, when her bones were soft and pliable. Families believed starting early prevented calluses and produced a smooth, curved arch. You flex your own toes beneath the sheets and shiver at the thought. In vernacular chronicles, there's a quirky tidbit that mothers used special herbal pastes, sometimes including crushed deer antler powder and orchid extract, to help bones break more cleanly. The paste was smeared along the instep before wrapping, supposedly dulling pain and accelerating reshaping. You shudder, wondering if you'd tear off that fragrant, bitter poultice after one sniff. This origin tale blends fact and myth. Some scholars still debate whether foot binding was a deliberate beauty trend or a gradual byproduct of shifting social norms around women's mobility. Historians still argue whether binding emerged as a status symbol restricting movement, to demonstrate leisure, or as a secret form of control over women's bodies, hidden under layers of silk skirts. As you breathe deeply, the debate feels distant, yet you sense its echoes in every whispered legend. Picture a Song-era courtyard garden, bamboo stalks swaying under moonlight. Young girls sit on low stools, their feet tucked under them. As older sisters and aunts deftly apply the herbal paste, they begin the wrapping. The toes are bent under, forcing all 5 bones to fold against the sole. Then the cloth is pulled snugly around the arch, heel, and instep, spiraling upward to secure the binding. At first, the wrap is loose enough to allow a slight tan line on the foot's outer curve. By dawn, it's tightened anew. This everyday ritual repeats weekly for months, each session a gamble between elegance and infection. You run your hand along a silken pillow edge, trying to tune out the imagined cries of discomfort. Yet fringe tales persist in some remote Jiangnan villages. Midwives reportedly administered small doses of opium-laced tea to calm screaming toddlers during initial bindings. You probably won't survive that first night, the records imply, but by imprisoning feet early, a woman could claim elegance for life. Legends say that Song poets composed odes praising golden lilies, but few mention the lifelong limp that followed. A mainstream fact, court records from 1092 CE note edicts praising slender, bound feet as the height of feminine allure, yet also caution about infections and ruptured blood vessels. Even the imperial physician Zhang Kongzhang advised moderation, warning that overly tight bindings could result in chronic disability. As your eyelids grow heavy, think of that flickering lantern, the same one that might cast tiny shadows on a bound foot, painting it as both precious artifact and troubled relic. Historians still argue whether foot binding was primarily aesthetic or if deeper cultural anxieties drove its practice. Was it a symbol of self-sacrifice for beauty, or a coercive ritual reinforcing patriarchal power? You let the question drift as you exhale. Before the moon sets, wealthy households commissioned artisans to craft miniature shoes, delicate silk slippers, embroidered with peonies or dragons, each pair measuring barely 3 inches. But that's a story for later. For now, rest your mind on the origins, a mix of courtly glamour, whispered dancer myths, and social competition that wove itself into the very bones of young girls. As you sink deeper into your pillow, imagine the first golden lotus steps taken centuries ago, echoing through time as both marvel and misery. You blink awake to the faint echo of silk on marble as you step into a candlelit imperial hall, recalling that dancer Yan Yang's shattered lotus legend from earlier. Tonight you drift among half-glimpsed myths of the first binders, the imperial concubines who, according to palace gossip, elevated foot binding from peasant quirk to courtly a mainstream fact. Song dynasty records from the mid-10th century mention concubine Pan Jinlian's peculiar gait, described as a delicate shuffle that enthralled Emperor Gaozong's ministers. Historians still argue whether Pan Jinlian was a real figure or a later literary invention, but her name gleams in foot-binding lore as the original trendsetter. In your mind's eye, you see Pan Jinlian ascending a marble dais, her feet swathed in satin making that signature click sound as though porcelain petals tapped against stone. Fringe storytellers whispered that her footsteps mimicked the call of the mythical lotus bird, a creature believed to alight only on the purest blossoms. You almost chuckle trying to imagine a bird dancing, but this bizarre detail lingers, as irrational as it is charming. Maybe that's why the myth stuck. As you sink into your mattress, you picture another version, a lowly palace attendant named Lin Est, who supposedly bound her feet secretly after overhearing court ladies praise petite toes. In one fringe account, she used spider silk threads painstakingly gathered from the palace garden's tiny strands so fine that her bindings were almost invisible. You shiver at the thought of spider silk cutting into tender flesh. But there's something soothing in the absurd image of a servant crouched under moonlight, gathering spider threads like some gothic florist arranging floral wire, moving through the hall. You overhear a court poet reciting verses about golden seeds that sprout in a woman's soul when her feet curve just so. This is no idle fancy. A mainstream fact notes that foot-binding imagery appears in song poetry circulated in Kaifeng, with over 200 surviving poems praising the lotus shape. Yet scholars still debate whether these poems reflect actual court trends or are later, romanticized retellings. Either way, the verse sold an ideal of femininity that rippled through teahouses and brocade merchants alike. As you exhale, consider the eerie elegance of these tales. One fringe anecdote claims an imperial seamstress fell so in love with the shape of bound feet that she tattooed tiny lotus flowers on her palms, believing the pain would bond her spirit to the beauty she stitched. You probably won't survive the thought of palm tattoos at court, but that's the sort of quirky myth that gives the practice its haunting allure. In quieter corners of the palace, servants whispered of Empress Wu herself decades before Song China testing foot-binding techniques on exotic dancers imported from the Tang court. According to legend, she instructed herbalists to concoct sticky rice wine pastes that made cloth cling like a second skin, leaving no creases. Mainstream fact. Historians have found medical texts from the Tang era describing herbal compresses for minor bone fractures, though none explicitly mentioned foot binding. Historians still argue whether these treatments inspired later binding rituals or were entirely separate medical practices. The candlelight flickers, and you feel that soft background hum of the fan. Remember to keep that going. You shift and imagine walking down the palace corridors, each step weighed with centuries-old expectations. Small feet equaled refined upbringing, proof you belonged to noble blood. A fringe theory suggests some concubines used ivory splints, carved by eunuchs to maintain an ideal arch, slipping them under starched bindings for a sharper curve. You'd like to think ivory is more glamorous than crushed deer antler paste, but either way it's a testament to people's obsession with shape. You inhale the faint scent of sandalwood burning in the hall, and the voices of poets drift back. When she walks, the world hushes, they wrote. In truth, binding may have started as a dance-proper way to dazzle courtiers, but it quickly mutated into a beauty regimen par excellence. A mainstream fact. Song fashion manuals from 1127 CE list lotus feet as a desirable feature, alongside elaborate hairpins and lacquered nails. Scholars still debate whether these manuals codified existing trends or tried to create aspirational ideals. The candle wavers, and you feel the weight of that debate in your bones, almost literally if they'd been bound. There's a gentle sarcasm in imagining how many palace ladies adjusted their gowns to accommodate painfully narrow steps, all for the sake of an ethereal shuffle. You steel yourself, flex your toes under the covers, and sense the absurd bravery it took. Fragments of speech float toward you with bound feet. She commands respect, says one young court lady, her voice sweet as plum wine. They say, a proper lotus step charms even dragons, adds another. You grin at the mental image of dragons swooning. It's the kind of myth that spreads just because it's so delightfully bizarre. Yet in every corner of the palace, these stories reinforce the practice, cloaking discomfort and mystique. As the fan hums on, you contemplate the power of myth. Those half-true anecdotes about concubines dancing on lotus ponds, shapes whispering secrets in each fold of cloth. Maybe foot-binding survived because stories like Pan Jinlian's gave it an aura of enchantment, making families willing to inflict pain on their daughters for a spark of otherworldly elegance. Historians still argue whether the origin myths were retrofitted after the custom exploded in popularity or if they genuinely sparked the trend. You close your eyes and let the hush of silk and sandalwood wash over you. Picture a final scene. A young noblewoman lifts her gown slightly, revealing perfect bound toes nestled in silk slippers. The hush is absolute. Even the caged songbirds in the garden seem to pause, as if paying homage. And then click, click, tiny shoes tap on the stone floor. echoing like petals falling on water. You drift on that echo, balancing myth and reality, legend and flesh. Let these stories swirl in your mind as you sink toward sleep, carried by the gentle cadence of hushed palace gossip and candlelit fantasy. After all, it's the myths behind the bindings that made them so enduring and just a bit magical. You wake to the rustle of silk skirts and the muted clink of porcelain bowls being set on low tables, the air scented with jasmine tea and sandalwood incense. Remember that faint sandalwood from the palace in Section 2. Tonight, you're seated on a woven bamboo mat in a sunlit courtyard, where the first foot binding ceremony is about to begin. A mainstream historical fact: in the Song dynasty, families typically performed the binding ceremony for girls between 4 and 7 years old, believing this age range ensured softer bones and fewer Historians still argue whether age 4 or 5 was truly optimal for the least pain. Some records say 4. Others insist 5, but either way, you probably won't survive imagining your bones bending so young. Soft laughter drifts through paper screens as mother, grandmother, and aunties gather around the nervous child. Imagining yourself squirming on that mat might make you regret skipping leg day. They've prepared a low wooden stool carved with auspicious dragon and phoenix motifs. Overturned bowls hold lengths of cloth, 10-foot strips of white cotton dyed with safflower for purity, trimmed with gold thread, a fringe belied detail. In some families they mixed powdered crushed pearls into the dye for a subtle shimmer, believing the luminous cloth would bestow a radiant soul on the wearer. You might choke on that pearl dust though. It sounds like choking glitter. The mother pours steaming jasmine tea into tiny cups that smell like a summer evening in Suzhou. A middle-aged aunt, her hair pinned with jade combs, unfurls a scroll, with calligraphy wishing lotus blooming grace in silver ink. A mainstream fact: families often recited auspicious poems, invoking lotus flower symbols of purity emerging from mud to sanctify the rite. Historians still argue whether these poems were composed by local literati or plucked from court anthologies, but you can almost taste the poetic grandeur on your tongue. A hush falls as the grandmother, the designated binding master, moves closer. She's an expert in the ritual steps, having overseen dozens of ceremonies. Her hands are steady, her gaze serene. You might expect tears, but there's an oddly calming order to it. She kneels and places the girl's foot on the stool, calls out the first restriction: no movement. You imagine being told that every time you reach for the remote. No dice. Next, she applies an herbal paste made from crushed deer antler, orchid extract, and licorice root. The scent, oathy, sweet, and faintly metallic, lingers in your nostrils as she spreads it along the instep. A quirky tidbit: some granny-level experts swore by adding powdered camphor to reduce swelling, while others claimed Tehusk ash helped seal the bindings tighter. You wonder if you'd accidentally sprinkle ash on your popcorn. With precision, she wraps the cloth strip around the toes, bending them under to touch the sole. You imagine trying that in yoga class, child's pose, extreme edition, and they're failing spectacularly. The cloth snakes upward in overlapping coils, pinching the arch, then the ankle, each turn tighter than the last. Every few rotations, she tugs to the exact tension needed, enough pain to reshape but not enough to maim. Legend says she judged this by the girl's pale lips and quiet breathing. You'd probably faint before she finished the first coil. The bindings tighten, the aunties begin a soft chant invoking ancestral spirits and lucky dragons. In the background, a tea-boy tiptoes with a lacquered tray bearing sticky rice cakes dipped in sugarcane syrup, offered to the girl afterward as a reward, though she's too dazed to taste. A mainstream fact: ceremonial offerings of sweet foods symbolize the wish for a sweet marriage and prosperous life. Scholars still debate whether these sweets were meant to ease pain chemically, given the sugar's calming effect, or purely symbolical. Some fringe practitioners passed around tiny glass bottles containing opium-infused oil, promising the first dose would dull anguish, a sort of ancient painkiller shake. You'd shake your head, remembering how a single sip of modern adjunct medicine almost put you to sleep last week. But imagine toddlers sipping a substance you now need a prescription for. That's dedication, though maybe a smidge reckless. Once both feet are bound, the grandmother ties off the last strip with a knot shaped like a miniature lotus. It's an aesthetic flourish and a signal that the ritual is complete. She whispers blessings in the girl's ear. May you walk lightly through life, beloved child. You can almost hear the crackle of incense smoke as the blessing drifts skyward. After the formal ceremony, the family helps the girl stand for the first time. You picture her wavering like a fledgling bird, arms outstretched, cheeks flushed. With each step, there's a tiny slap as cloth meets wood, a sound both gentle and jarring, reminding the onlookers of the ceremony's cost. A mainstream fact: historical diaries note that younger sisters sometimes practiced walking on bound feet for days before public display, often using furniture for support. Historians still argue whether these rehearsal sessions mitigated long-term damage or simply delayed it. As the sun dips low, the courtyard feast begins. Under paper lanterns shaped like lotus blossoms, family members exchange knowing looks and offer words of encouragement. You sit among them, sipping a chrysanthemum, wine that's floral and slightly bitter, a quirky detail in some regions. They added a pinch of powdered dragon's beard candy to the drink for extra sweetness and texture. Imagine sipping wine with strands of candy floss swirling in your glass. Guests recline on silk cushions, nibbling sticky rice balls as they tease the girl gently. Careful, your feet might lift you off the ground with such elegance. They laugh softly, their voices lulling you. You might snort at the absurd compliment, but there's a warmth in their acceptance. A shared belief that perfect lotus feet herald social grace and familial honor. As the night deepens, they present the girl with her first pair of lotus's shoes, miniature silk slippers embroidered with peonies and phoenixes, delicate as butterfly wings. They glimmer in lantern light. She tries them on, the fabric hugging her bound toes like a second skin. The courtyard erupts in quiet applause. Even the moon seems to pause its glow for a moment. The ritual concludes, not with fanfare but with hushed reverence. The girl is swaddled in soft cotton pads, her feet gently massaged before new bindings replace the old. You imagine being tucked in this way every night, your toes numb beneath layers of scented cloths. As you lie back under your own sheets, you feel the ceremony's rhythm echoing in your chest, the deliberate tugs, the chants, the sweet offerings, and the final hush of silk shoes meeting wooden floor. Historians still argue whether the ceremony's solemnity masked underlying coercion or provided communal bonding and rite of passage comfort. But for now, let the images of jasmine tea, lotus knots, and candlelit faces blend into your dreams. You awaken to the faint creak of wooden floorboards and the distant hum of the courtyard fan lingering in your mind. Remember that warm jasmine-scented hush from Section 3. Tonight you're back inside that same household, crouched before a low-lacquered chest holding bundles of cloth and jars of herbal pastes. It's time for your first real lesson in the art of crushing and wrapping, the weekly ritual that transforms supple feet into the hallmark golden lotus shape. You tuck your knees under you, palms pressed to cool tiles, trying not to flinch as you watch the grandmother, the family's revered binding master, lay out the tools of reshaping a mainstream fact. Song Dynasty medical manuals note that foot binders fractured 3 bones in the arch, the cuboid, navicular, and cuneiform, to achieve a high arch and fold the toes under the sole. You can almost hear a dull snap as each bone gives way, though in truth families relied on slow, steady pressure rather than a surgeon's blade. Historians still argue whether these bends were officially sanctioned medical breaks or emergent folk techniques passed down in hushed whispers. You probably won't survive picturing a toddler's bones contorting inch by inch. But there's a method to this madness, or so they claim. Before beginning, the grandmother dips her fingers into a small porcelain bowl filled with a thick, beige paste. She scoops a fingertip's worth and presses it against the instep of the girl's foot. You lean closer, catching a faint, earthy scent tinged with orchid and licorice root just as you smelled at the ceremony. But now the paste's purpose shifts from ritual to practical. Fringe accounts insist some families mixed camphor oil into the paste, creating a mild numbing effect, while others added crushed deer antler powder to encourage bones to crumble cleanly under pressure. You shudder, wondering if you'd spritz your morning latte with camphor if you believed it would dull your taste buds enough to choke down kale dots with the paste applied. The grandmother lifts the girl's foot and begins to bend the toes toward the sole, pressing them gently yet firmly. You imagine trying that in a yoga class extreme toe talk twist, and failing so spectacularly the instructor gives up on teaching you. Each toe folds downward, meeting the ball of the foot, and the flesh flushes pink. Then, the grandmother lays the first strip of cloths across the toes, wrapping it so tightly that the fabric digs into skin, forcing the bones deeper into that fold. A fringe detail suggests some aristocratic families used ivory splints carved by palace eunuchs to wedge between fabric layers, ensuring a perfect curve. You'd expect ivory to be more glamorous, but you'd probably wince at its chill against your skin. She tightens the cloth in a spiral, moving from the toes up toward the arch, applying gradual tension. Another mainstream fact: historical treatises describe footbinders pulling with measured strengths, often using a fixed bar or wooden stick as leverage to apply 10 to 15 pounds of force per rap. You might compare that to strapping your feet into weight machines at the gym, minus the cushion pads and workout playlist. Historians still argue whether such tension was calibrated by feel alone or if early binders kept rudimentary weight measurements on hand. You can almost see an ant fiddling with a primitive brass scale two-way cloth tension. Could we add half an ounce more? And you snort, picturing them obsessing over foot weight like indie coffee roasters sampling beans. As each wrap tightens, the grandmother alternates between cloth and soft cotton padding. The padding acts like a buffer, preventing open sores, but it also bulks the fold, making the arch even more pronounced once it's removed. You recall the scent of sandalwood incense from Section 2 drifting through the Palestite's room. Is scented instead with the slightly sweet aroma of licorice root, dancing with a faint metallic note you assume comes from the deer antler powder. A quirky tidbit: in some rural villages, midwives sprinkled powdered tea husks between cloth layers to absorb moisture and reduce the chance of fungus, a kind of ancient foot deodorant. You'd probably name your next sneaker line Tea Crunch, if that was still trending. Once the strips have reached the ankle, the grandmother ties off the final knot in a neat lotus shape, signaling the end of the wrap. You can hear the girl's shallow breaths, her chest rising and falling, like gentle waves. The grandmother then presses down on the arch with both thumbs, coaxing the bones to fracture softly. You'd think that would elicit tears, but she times each press with the girl's exhale, making the pain less of a jolt and more of a slow burn. A mainstream fact. Some bindings incorporated periodic breaks to let the girl rest, after which the process resumed tighter than before. Historians still argue whether these rest intervals baffled families into thinking progress was gentler or merely prolonged the agony either way. The result was the same. As you imagine your own toes being folded under with each twist of cloth. The grandmother produces small wooden wedges shaped like lotus petals. She slips these between the bindings and the foot's curves to secure the arch angle, like placing a prop under a dip in a curtain. Fringe lore says that wealthy patrons sometimes commissioned wedges made of sandalwood or ivory, believing the material imparted strength and grace to the binding. You'd almost welcome a bit of sandalwood fragrance if it made your socks smell nicer, but here it's an emblem of the practice's ritualistic excess. Now the girl stands wobbly but upright, her toes bent cruelly beneath her. She takes a tentative step, and you imagine the raw friction between flesh and cloth. The grandmother coaches her quietly, one step at a time. Lotus blossom. The girl haltingly shifts her weight, her arch feeling like a coiled spring. What a ridiculous mental image. Coiled springs inside a foot. Yet in these ongoing sessions, usually held weekly or bi-weekly, the binding is tightened incrementally, inch by inch, season by season. A mainstream fact. Diaries from the 12th century mark binding sessions on lunar calendars, indicating families timed sessions with new moons to sync with auspicious energy. Scholars still debate whether lunar timing was for mystical reasons or simply a way to keep a consistent schedule. The grandmother inspects each foot, looking for pressure, sores, or misshapen folds. If she spots redness, she loosens a few wraps at the night ritual to allow circulation before reapplying by dawn. You might wish for an app that buzzes your phone when your feet need checking time for your nightly unbind, but that would totally break the historical mood. One fringe account tells of a besotted suitor who sketched detailed anatomical diagrams of his beloved's bound feet, documenting blood flow patterns as if preparing for a medical journal article. You giggle at the romantic scientist image, yet can't help feeling a bit proud of such obsessive attention. Finally, the ritual ends with a light massage using fragrant oils, often camphor or crushed mint, to soothe the skin and signal closure. The girl collapses onto a cushion, feet swaddled in soft cotton once again. You imagine resting your own toes under layers of scented cloth, trying not to groan. The grandmother says a soft blessing, then straightens. Patience and beauty grow. From pain, you roll your eyes. Gently. Pain has never felt so much like a beauty pageant as you settle back into your pillow. The scene fades, the silk slippers, the dripping paste, the tight coils of cloth, and the lotus wedge props. You sense the ritual's precision, the incremental torture masked as tender care. Historians still argue whether the ceremony's technical precision was driven by artisan pride or simple cruelty cloaked in cultural norms. Either way, it's a grotesque ballet of cloth and bone, executed with ancestral devotion every week for years. Let that image of twisted cloth binding tiny bones become a lullaby of paradoxes. Elegance born from agony, beauty from restraint, and every tight spiral a testament to societal obsession. As you drift, remember that each whisper of cloth against skin echoes those Song-era homes where young girls learned the art of walking like lotus blossoms, all for the sake of an ethereal shuffle that clicked across marble floors. You wake to the hiss of boiling water for morning tea, the same incense-scented hush that trailed off at the end of those crushing and wrapping sessions. Remember the licorice roots paste and sandalwood wedges from section 4. Today, you're learning what daily life feels like on those tiny, painfully sculpted lotus feet. Imagine tying your shoelaces and realizing your toes have vanished. That's your starting point. You're seated on a low, cushioned Kong table, ankles wrapped, and a court maid offers you a porcelain cup brimming with chrysanthemum tea. A mainstream fact by the Ming Dynasty. Bound feet measured between 2 to 4 inches, forcing women to adopt a distinct lotus walk, balancing on the outer edges of their heels to move at all. Historians still argue whether this altered gait was meant to project demureness or simply emerged from necessity, and you probably won't survive picturing every step as a delicate tilt toward certain disaster. You lift the teacup with trembling, fingers coated in enough paste scent to rival a modern hand sanitizer, trying not to spill golden liquid on your silk robes. In grand palaces, ladies attended tea ceremonies seated on footstools with oval indentations to cradle their bound arches, as though the world insisted on providing ergonomic support for improbable feet. A quirky tidbit: some elite households installed miniature footstool stations, shallow water basins filled with rose petals and warmed by charcoal embers, so women could soak their feet after agonizing morning walks. You giggle at that. A medieval spa day, minus cucumber slices but with plenty of bone-breaking. As you take a hesitant sip, you recall how the grandmother in section 3 insisted on jasmine tea to calm nerves. Well, here you are, teacup in hand, wondering why herbal drinks never come with a may cause extreme foot envy warning. The tea ceremony itself is an exercise in slow grace. Each movement is calibrated, from lifting the porcelain cup to rotating it 3 times before sipping. You're told this rotation signifies the 3 blessings of longevity, prosperity, and bound-arch beauty. You'd rotate your phone 3 times hoping for a Wi-Fi signal, but bear with the tradition. It's one more flourish in the elaborate ballet of daily etiquette. Once tea is done, you're helped to rise. Here's the trick. You shift weight to your wide sleeves, lean on a carved wooden railing, and inch forward in tiny hops. A mainstream fact. Chronic limping and uneven weight distribution caused lifelong spinal curvature in many bound-foot women. Historians still argue whether corrective back brace is often hidden beneath robes were intended more as medical devices or as silent reminders of women's proper posture. You snort softly, imagining a corset-like brace promising straight, spine-bound pride. Your first task is to serve tea to visiting dignitaries. You shuffle through a jade-screened corridor, silk hem brushing lacquered wood, each step a cautious tilt outward. Your ankles ache within padded bindings, but you've grown surprisingly nimble like a malfunctioning robot programmed for ballet. You probably won't survive a modern dance recital, but here you perform a tiny pirouette, balancing on angled heels, to place the cup before a cordially snoring eunuch envoy. He murmurs thanks, unaware of the acrobatic effort you just performed for that single bow. After tea service, it's time for chores. In rural settings, peasant wives with bound feet adapted differently. They used walking sticks carved from bamboo to support each step around the rice paddy's fringe. A fringe account suggests that in some mountain villages, women attached small stilts like tiny wooden stilts cut from sandalwood saplings to the soles of their lotus shoes so they could navigate muddy fields without slipping. You laugh at the thought, medieval stilts, now in sandalwood edition. But historians still argue whether these stilts were a folk innovation born of necessity or were later romanticized in local legends. Back in the palace, you're leading a silk embroidery session perhaps, recalling the quiet transition to needlework talked about in section 17. You sit cross-legged or as close as cross-legged you can manage with crushed arches, needle threading gold and crimson, silk into a pair of miniature shoes. Each stitch is precise. Slip once, and the floral motif warps, like dropping a pixel in your favorite video game. A mainstream fact. Lotus shoes were often embroidered with auspicious symbols, peonies for wealth, cranes for longevity, or pomegranates for fertility. You joke that a misplaced peony stitch could doom you to an unseemly fate, undercooked rice, forever. As you embroider, you glance at the courtyard through lattice windows. Servants line up trays of steamed buns and sugar-dusted lotus seed deserts. You nibble one, only to find your teeth clatter against porcelain emblems on the tray, a reminder that everything around you seems miniature. A quirky tidbit. Some households insisted on using tiny bamboo chopsticks so women could eat without overstretching their arms. A weaponized approach to ensuring the body remained contained within prescribed boundaries. You'd need chopsticks the size of knitting needles to manage your Instagram breakfast bowl. But here, less is more. Post-embroidery, it's time for paperwork, recording guest names, gifting embroidered silk pouches to brides-to-be, and drafting thank you notes in fluid calligraphy. You sit at a low desk, paper unrolled before you, wrists propped on slender porcelain rests. A mainstream fact. Boundfoot women served as scribes and amateur scholars in literati circles, favored for their delicate hands and refined sensibilities. Yet historians still argue whether this role empowered women intellectually or simply confined them to non-physical labor, reinforcing domestic boundaries. You imagine a modern office cubicle outfitted with ergonomic wrist rests. Welcome to the ancient female workforce. Afternoon sunlight filters through paper panes, and you're summoned to practice your lotus walk again. You rise carefully, pressing your palms to the railing, then lift each foot high enough to clear the threshold. Your gait is a series of graceful lurches, slogged by pain but refined through years of ceremony. A fringe anecdote claims some women practiced in front of water-filled basins, checking their reflection to perfect their posture, the same way modern dancers use mirrors. You can't help but giggle. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who has the tiniest, most tortured feet of all? By dusk, you're exhausted in a way modern shoe buyers never experienced, no matter how narrow your stilettos. You retire to a low couch where a foot servant removes your bindings, easing out cloth by cloth. There's that familiar hiss of fabric sliding against flesh, mingled with the scent of rice tusk powder from Section 4's midnight tales. Your toes unfold like reluctant shutters opening to light. A mainstream fact. Nightly unbinding sessions were essential to prevent infection and check for sores. Though many girls slept with bindings reapplied to maintain shape, Historians still argue whether unbinding increased long-term mobility or risked reversing shape progress. But either way, it introduced a brief moment of relief, and you savor every millimeter of freedom before bed. You perform gentle foot massages, with camphor oil coaxing warmth back into your arches. You recall that fringe story of the suitor who sketched blood flow patterns. Thankfully, your massage is less scientific, more whispered comfort. You sigh as the soft pressure kneads out. Twinges of pain, a lullaby of knuckles against bone. As you slip back into your nightclothes, layers of silk trimmed with lotus motifs, you realize that daily life on tiny feet is a perpetual dance, balancing elegance, obedience, pain, and pride in every minuscule step. Historians still argue whether bound feet isolated women in gilded cages or paradoxically offered them power within domestic spheres, a private domain inaccessible to unbound men. Tonight, as you nestle into your futon, remember that every chore, tea service, and stitch carried significance. Each tiny hop was both a crowning achievement and a reminder of societal devotion to a beauty standard etched into bone. You wake to the faint scent of damp silk and the rustle of embroidered slippers being unpacked. Remember the jade-screened corridor and silk embroidery from Section 5. Tonight, your world shrinks to the lacquered floor before you, where dozens of miniature shoes await your examination, each more delicate than a butterfly's wing. You lean forward, tracing their tiny soles with your fingertip, acutely aware that these shoes, often called golden lotus shoes, are both art objects and instruments of social control, a mainstream fact. By the late Ming dynasty, most lotus shoes measured between 2 and 3 inches long, meticulously crafted to fit the bound foot's high arch and curled toes. You almost giggle imagining shoeboxes labeled size shrimp lining a boutique shelf, complete with 1-inch heel. Disclaimers. Historians still argue whether these shoes evolved from peasant foot wrappings or were invented by court artisans to cater to wealthy patrons' vanity, and you probably won't survive picturing an artisan trying on a tiny slipper himself. But that's the sort of modern absurdity that lightens the grave tradition. The first pair you pick up shimmers in lantern light, deep crimson silk embroidered with golden peony symbols of wealth and honor. You recall the peony stitch mishap from Section 5, where a misplaced motif was said to curse a dinner party. A fringe tidbit whispers that some families stitched tiny real coins into the fabric folds, hoping the clink of metal would drive away evil spirits and announce the bride's arrival. You imagine a bride's entrance punctuated by jingling. It's like wedding bells gone rogue. As you hold the crimson shoe, notice the slender upturned toe box, curling like a crescent moon. The interior is lined with soft cotton, dyed faintly lavender with imported woad, a quirky detail. Footwear merchants sometimes soaked the cotton in scented oils, jasmine, rose, or even exotic agar wood to ensure a lingering fragrance with every step. You'd love a whiff of sandalwood-scented sneakers, but you'd probably avoid wearing them at the gym. Next, you turn to a pair of pale blue slippers embroidered with cranes and pine bows. Pine symbolizes endurance. Cranes promise longevity in low, amused tones. You mutter, "Walk long enough and maybe you'll outlive your shoes." Yet the cranes appear mid-flight, as though they might lift your bound feet off the ground. Scholarly debate note. Historians still argue whether these auspicious motifs expressed personal wishes or simply followed mainstream aesthetic trends popularized in court fashion manuals. Either way, you sense the power such tiny images wielded in a woman's life story. You slide your fingers along raised satin stitches, count them if you dare, at least 200 per shoe, and feel the variance in thread thickness. A fringe rumor claims some artisans used spider silk threads for ultrafine embroidery, gathered painstakingly from palace gardens at dawn. Spider silk, they said, was stronger than buff leather, though you'd likely sneeze through any spider silk allergy. You picture ghostly spiders spinning filaments under moonlight, fueling a trade secret so bizarre it seems like a bedtime hallucination. Turning your attention to a pair of white silk shoes adorned with intertwining lotus vines, you notice tiny seed pod motifs scattered between leaves. These are fertility symbols, subtly woven into the design. A mainstream fact, fertility-themed embroidery, decorated marriage-bound, women's lotus shoes as a hopeful invocation of many offspring. Historians still argue whether brides wore specific symbols only for wedding ceremonies or carried fertility motifs in daily life until their first pregnancy. You squint at the minuscule vine loops, feeling a mild sense of vertigo. Imagine embroidering that pattern at arm's length with bare feet screaming beneath. As candlelight flickers across the shoe array, you spot a playful pair of oxblood slippers dotted with mischievous mythical creatures. Killin and Pixiu, guardians of wealth. A quirky anecdote suggests some families insisted on injecting a few grains of gold dust into the stitching mixture, so every step scattered tiny flecks of prosperity. You can't help laughing. Caution, may leave glitter trail, yet acknowledge how these myths reinforced societal aspirations through every embroidered stitch. You set that pair aside and reach for a simpler paleo shoe, its surface decorated with uniform rows of gold-threaded chrysanthemums. Chrysanthemums, you remember a gardener Antoine's side, symbolize autumn's gentle decline. A fringe detail claims courtesans favored chrysanthemum designs as a discreet nod to fleeting beauty, pairing them with violet-dyed stockings. You imagine a harpsichord playing softly, the rustle of a silk fan fanning the air, each chrysanthemum bloom carrying a secret message. Historians still argue whether courtesans drove these trends, or merely adapted popular motifs for their own circles. Your fingers brush against a final pair, midnight blue slippers with silver thread constellations sprinkled across them. These starry night shoes are rare, crafted under astrologers' instructions to appease celestial forces. A mainstream fact: some southern artisan guilds documented embroidery patterns aligned with seasonal star charts, believing perfect alignment brought blessings. Historians still argue whether such guild records reflected actual astronomical consultations or were retrospective justifications for elaborate designs. You lean in, letting the faint glimmer of silver thread lull you like moonlight on water. Intangible and soothing dots between each pair. The low wooden footrest you sit on creaks softly, a gentle reminder of the courtyard fan's constant hum. You let that hum synchronize with your breath as you admire the shoes arrayed before you. The craftsmanship, the symbolism, the sheer absurdity of footwear so small it defies both function and logic. These shoes embody paradox, tools of restriction, transformed into objets d'art through generations of needle and thread. You pause to recall the secret embroidery codes previewed in Section 14, tiny heart-shaped stitches indicating forbidden love, hidden among floral swirls. Some shoes contained invisible ink dots between stitches, marking political allegiances or family secrets. Each pair here could carry its own clandestine narrative beneath the floral surface. You shiver at the idea of a spy's lotus slippers, smuggling messages beneath multiple cloth layers delivered note to courtyard after midnight. As the lanterns dim slightly, you lift your gaze to the courtyard beyond. Lotus blossoms drift on a stone pond, echoing the shoe motifs around you. The contrast between living lotus and stitched vines in silk creates a lullaby of shapes: curved petals, curling toes, infinite loops of thread. You breathe deeply, feeling the weight of centuries of women who slipped their tiny feet into these shoes, walking lives shaped by silk and bone. Before moving on, take one last moment. Spread your fingers over the richest embroidery. Imagine the countless hours an artisan poured into each pair, stitch by patient stitch. Let the quiet grandeur of these miniature masterpieces settle in your mind like a soft lull. Historians still argue whether the aesthetic triumph overshadowed the human cost of debate. To drift with as you fade toward sleep. Allow the echo of that question to soften into the background. Beauty born from constraint, art forged in pain, stories whispered in embroidery. And as the fan's hum blends with your slow exhale, the velvet lotus shoes shimmer one final time before you turn away, carrying their silent weight into your dreams. You awaken to the soft chime of a jade gong echoing through a pavilion lush with potted chrysanthemums. Remember the silk embroidery and lotus shoes arrayed before you in Section 6. Tonight, you slip into the manicured gardens of a prosperous Ming household where every stone path and carved balustrade signals prestige. Here, bound feet aren't just a painful ritual. They are potent status symbols, teeny badges proclaiming elite standing and sparkling prospects of a lucrative marriage. A mainstream fact: by the 16th century, small, bound feet, often measuring no more than 3 inches, were considered the pinnacle of feminine beauty among the gentry, and families proudly displayed their daughters' lotus feet at matchmaker meetings. You follow a silk-robed matchmaker led by lantern light, her thick brush painting intricate patterns of auspicious symbols on a scroll ledger. Historians still argue whether the societal emphasis on petite feet arose primarily from Confucian ideals of feminine virtue or emerged as a competitive display among affluent clans. But either way, you probably won't survive picturing matrimonial negotiations centered on does a foot arch rival that of Madame Wu's daughter over cups of plum wine. As you wander down the peony-lined path, you hear whispers of gossip. Young Lady Zhong's 3-inch beauties are already spoken for at her family's spring banquet. A fringe tidbit says some families hired professional dancers to flaunt their lotus step prowess at these banquets. As if recruiting a dance troupe instead of vetting a bride, you can almost see a troupe of dancers twirling in miniature silk shoes, their bound toes clicking like a metronome. And here comes the bride. Folks, 2.8 inches of pure marital promise. You approach a pavilion where a string of crimson lanterns bathes a low table stacked with silver hairpins and lacquered boxes. Inside are foot measuring tools, a polished ivory ruler scored in inch increments, and a jade caliper used to verify the coveted 3-inch golden lotus. You reach for the ivory ruler, running your fingertip along the engraved scale, marveling at how a tool so small wielded so much social power. A mainstream fact: household records from Suzhou archives note that girls with bound feet received larger bride prices and more elaborate dowries, reflecting how elite families equated tiny feet with refined upbringing. Historians still argue whether these bride price disparities were driven by genuine aesthetic preference or simply became self-perpetuating status competitions, like designer handbags for the toes. Softly, You sip a cup of winter melon tea offered by a maid whose own feet are perfectly bound. The liquid is cool and faintly sweet, the crystals of rock sugar clinking against your porcelain cup like celebratory confetti. You almost laugh at the absurdity. Here's to your tiny toes, may they fetch you a million silver tails. Yet, every sip cements the ritual's gravity nearby. A scribe records matchmaker assessments, doodling lotus petals beside each suitor's name. One note reads, slight imbalance, but excellent embroidery skill, proof that needlework prowess could offset a marginal foot-length flaw. A quirky detail. Some resourceful families taught daughters to master intricate embroidery patterns so impressively that matchmakers annotated exceptional needle speed next to lotus foot arc. You chuckle imagining a foot versus embroidery trade-off in a modern dating app profile likes long walks on the beach but really great at Photoshop. As you walk through the rose-tinted arbor, the matchmaker points out a tiered pavilion reserved for match presentations. It's draped in pastel silks and peony garlands, with low lacquer tables set with dainty snacks, candied hawthorn slices, and sugared lotus seeds. A mainstream fact, matchmaking ceremonies often featured foot-revealing customs, where prospective grooms examined shoes and even gently lifted the cloth bindings to assess callus levels and arch curves. Historians still argue whether such intimate inspections were a genuine measure of fertility and health or simply another spectacle in the theater of status. Imagine a modern blind date requiring you to disrobe your toes before dinner. You imagine the tension. You stand barefoot on a carved wooden platform, bound feet wrapped in pastel cloth. The prospective groom kneels, loosening the ribbons just enough to glance at swelling and scraped texture, then replaces the cloth and rises with a formal bow. The hush is broken by soft gasps from assembled relatives, like spectators at a tennis match waiting to see if you break serve. You shiver, picturing that awkward intimacy, venturing deeper into the garden. You pass a miniature pond where lotus blossoms float on still water, mirrored by the tiny lotus shoes lined along the stone edge. A fringe myth suggests that affluent mothers sometimes placed actual lotus buds beneath their daughters' beds to inspire. The shape of the bound foot like botanical mood boards for bone structure. You grin at the absurd image of small girls sleeping atop lotus petals, hoping their bones absorb floral geometry in dreams. The matchmaker gestures to a richly dressed lady seated on a cushioned bench, her mother, perhaps her gaze proud yet measured. Her own bound feet are hidden beneath layers of silk, but you know they're impeccably small, the original standard your binding master used as a template. You recall that in some clans, mothers passed down foot binding techniques, like family heirlooms, complete with recipe books for herbal pastes and annotated cloth weaving patterns. A mainstream fact, genealogical records sometimes included foot binding diaries, chronicling each tightening session's date, cloth type, and arch measurement. Scholars still debate whether these diaries reflect a medical curiosity about bone adjustment or morbid vanity like a Fitbit for your toes. As dusk falls, the matchmaker leads you back through a bamboo grove, whispering advice. A woman with great feet petition heaven itself for blessings. Ensure your feet signal virtue, restraint, and refinement. You almost mock that statement, petition heaven through compressed toes. But deep down sense how woven the practice was into cosmology and Confucian decorum. Tonight, as you settle onto a moonlit bench cushioned with silk brocade, you rub your ankles swollen from pageantry yet proud. The moonlight filters through filigreed lattice, creating lace-like patterns on your robes. You breathe in the jasmine-scented breeze, tasting the echoes of plum wine, winter melon tea, and candied lotus seeds still lingering on your tongue. Historians still argue whether the marriage market fervor around bound feet empowered elite women with social leverage by transforming bodily constraint into a symbol of cultivation, or whether it was purely patriarchal artifice, masking control with elegance. You let that paradox settle as you sink into the soft cushion, balancing pride and pain like a lotus on water. As your eyelids grow heavy, imagine the hush of families negotiating alliance after alliance, a delicate dance around bound feet that determined fortune and fate. Let that image of silk slippers, ivory rulers, and matchmakers' scrolls merge into a lullaby of status and sacrifice. And as the jade gong's faint echo fades, you drift on the thought that beauty itself can be both a fortress and a cage, just like those tiny, constrained feet that carried women toward their futures. You rouse to the distant crow of a village rooster and the earthy scent of wet fields, not the jade gong or jasmine incense of Section 7's gentry garden, but the rough-hewn world of rural China, where foot binding drifts down from courtly heights into peasant life. Tonight, you trail smoky cooking fires and straw-thatched roofs, witnessing how families of modest means adapted the golden lotus ideal to their own rhythms and resources. A mainstream fact, by the late Ming and early Qing periods, foot binding that had spread widely among peasant communities, with about 50 to 60% of rural girls undergoing the practice. Though bindings were often looser and shoes coarser than their urban counterparts, historians still argue whether this diffusion was driven by genuine local desire for prestige or by economic pressure to conform to tax and marriage expectations. And you probably won't survive picturing an entire hamlet measuring little girls' feet at the village market like livestock. But frantic mothers believed it necessary in this thatched courtyard. You find a makeshift binding table fashioned from a wooden crate and a patched straw mat. Strong-shouldered grandmothers crouch beside it, using strips of old cotton sarongs dyed with indigo scraps, salvaged from worn-out farmers' shirts. A quirky detail: some remote villages favored midnight blue cloth remnants from fish sails, believing the threads carried good luck from the sea. You raise an eyebrow at the thought of your toes smelling like fishnets. But these folk variations have a charm all their own. You sit on a low wooden stool, one you'd use for milking goats, while the grandmother, her fingers stained with indigo, applies a mixture of ground rice hulls and wild mint leaves as a cheap substitute for the expensive Dirndl paste you read about in Section 4. The aroma is sharp and minty, less refined than courtly orchid-scented pastes, but it's effective enough to numb the edges of pain. Historians still argue whether local herbal substitutes offered real analgesic benefits or simply reflected resourcefulness in poverty, but you gulp, unwilling to test the theory on your own ankles. Next, toes are folded under in cloth strips, loop around the foot in a pattern that seems haphazard compared to the tight precision of noble households. Here, bindings loosen by nightfall for chores. There's no nightly ritual of scented unwrapping. Instead, women slip off one layer to fetch water from the well or tend vegetable beds, then reapply the cloth before sunset. A fringe account claims some mountain hamlets even invented quick-release knots so children could dash barefoot to school. Imagine a medieval shoe that snaps off for recess, but you'd probably break both ankles testing that feature. Daily life on these rustic bindings is a choreography of necessity. You follow a peasant girl named May as she balances a yoke of morning rice baskets on her shoulders, her feet wrapped in indigo cloth, walking in a deliberate ducking shuffle across muddy ruts. A mainstream fact: field laborers with bound feet developed unique gaits, using larching steps and bent knees to reduce pressure on arches. Historians still argue whether these adaptations mitigated long-term mobility issues or simply compensated. Until age stiffened joints, but watching May trudge through knee-deep mud, you sense that ingenuity trumped comfort. At midday, you're invited to share millet porridge cooked in a clay pot over an open fire. You bring your basin close, tipping your bound feet outward to avoid splatters. A quirky tidbit: some rural cooks tossed a handful of dried chrysanthemum petals into the porridge, borrowing courtly tea customs, believing it soothed lotus burns as your skin chafed against cloth. You wrinkle your nose at petal bits in breakfast medieval granola bar crossover, but you admit the porridge tastes unexpectedly floral. After lunch, May leads you to the village's simple footbinders circle, an impromptu gathering under a willow tree where mothers trade tips. One auntie demonstrates a local twist. Instead of ivory wedges from Section 4, they carve small wooden shims from discarded bamboo shoots, pressing them under bindings to achieve the desired arch angle. You cringe recalling ivory's cool touch. But note, bamboo has a sturdier vibe, eco-friendly foot torture. You muse. Historians still argue whether these bamboo wedges created more infection risk than smoother ivory, but rural practicality often outweighed sanitary concerns. While the circle chatters, you overhear talk of embroidered folk shoes, unlike luxurious peony motifs from Section 6. Village shoes sport rough cross-stitch patterns of roosters and grain, sheaves emblems of harvest and good luck. A mainstream fact: local artisans used hemp twine dyed with walnut husks to stitch protective symbols into coarse linen slippers. Scholars still debate whether these simplistic motifs held genuine talismanic power or were mere bumper stickers on foot coverings. You can't help smiling at a pair embroidered with a plump rooster, imagining it crowing each time you took a step. As afternoon light fades, May shows you the final step: sealing bindings with a paste of sticky rice water, creating a protective varnish. She chirps that in their clan, this finish kept cloth from unraveling during monsoon mud season. A fringe story suggests some sisters mixed a dash of bird droppings into the rice paste, believing avian enzymes sped healing and reduced odor. That'd be the VIP spa treatment. You joke, wrinkling your nose at the thought of poop. Foot polish. Then comes the hardest task: navigating the steep hillside path to the herbalist's hut, where May's mother fetches antiseptic barks to treat inevitable blisters. You cling to a bamboo railing, gingerly placing one foot in front of the other. A mainstream fact: peasant records indicate that topical treatments used local willow bark infusions rich in salicylic acid to ward off infection. Historians still argue whether these folk remedies matched the effectiveness of courtly Durantler powder formulas. But standing on that hill, you bet a fresh willow poultice feels more natural than fancy bone dust. At dusk, the village healer wraps your feet loosely with fresh indigo cloths, just enough to hold the bamboo wedges and herbs in place so you can join the others in the communal moon viewing feast. Lanterns hang from low eaves, casting orange glows. On wooden tables heaped with rice cakes and fermented bean curd, you attempt the lotus shuffle along the porch. using outstretched arms for balance, nearly toppling into a barrel of pickled radish. You snort laughter despite the ache. Bountiful. Radish bath incoming. You quip. As the moon climbs overhead. Villagers share stories, how one grandmother bound her daughters by moonlight to avoid nosy neighbors, or how another clan secretly taught girls to release bindings for school festivals before at home. These anecdotes underscore a curious flexibility. Peasant binding wasn't monolithic but adapted to local rhythms of work, festival, and belief. Historians still argue whether such regional variations diluted the practice's intended symbolism or enriched its cultural tapestry, but here in the yarn-spun night, you sense both unity and diversity before you depart. May's grandmother presses a pair of hemp fiber slippers into your hands for the journey. They're rough and utilitarian, the antithesis of silk lotus shoes, but they cradle your broken-in bindings with surprising gentleness. You slip them on, wincing at the coarseness, but grateful for the padded arch support hidden inside, as you trudge back to the thatched inn where your night's rest awaits. Recall the jade-screened garden and ivory rulers of Section 7, the lacquered floors of Section 6, and the ornate rituals of Sections 2 and 3 now. Taste the salt of sweat on your brow, feel the scratch of hemp twine, and hear the tinny click of makeshift bamboo wedges. Footbinding in peasant life was no less beautiful in its own rustic way, woven into everyday toil and community bonds. Historians still argue whether rural adaptations softened or strengthened the practice's grip on Chinese culture, but for tonight, let the image of indigo bindings, bamboo wedges, and rooster-stitch slippers lull you. Beauty born from resourcefulness, pain cushioned by community, and the golden lotus ideal reinterpreted by hands that tilled the land. You awaken to the gentle whisper of a silken banner fluttering in a courtyard breeze, a distinct contrast from the rustic clatter of bamboo wedges and indigo bindings in Section 8. Tonight, you trace the winding silk routes that brought shimmering threads to workshops crafting lotus shoes and embroidered slippers from Chang'an to Canton. Picture caravans of camels plodding through desert sands, laden with raw silk cocoons, silk traders haggling over bales of fabric in dusty bazaars, and junks skimming down the Grand Canal with crates of dyed silk, destined for palace looms. A mainstream fact, by the Song dynasty, China produced over 30,000 tons of raw silk annually, much of it transported via the Silk Road and internal waterways to urban centers where artisan guilds specialized in embroidery and shoemaking. Historians, we still argue whether northern inland routes or southern maritime passages supplied luxury markets more efficiently, and you probably won't survive imagining a single cargo hold filled edge to edge with silk cocoons, the air thick with moth-shed fuzz. You stand beside a camel caravan resting near Dunhuang, the air scented faintly with camel hair in desert time. Traders unwrapped Hessian sacks stuffed with yellow-green cocoons, sorting them by quality. Fringe lore tells of a Silk Road merchant who hid tiny lotus shoe patterns in the folds of his silk bales, dreaming of combining desert commerce with courtly fashion, but most likely, those were backgammon stories told around campfires. Yet you can still imagine the thrill of discovering a secret design tucked within your trading goods. From Dunhuang, Silk Bolt's journey by mule caravan over the Hexi corridor, arriving at Chang'an's bustling markets via wealthy patrons seek bolts of raw silk gauze stitched with gold threads for their daughters' lotus shoes. You slip into the cacophony of the market. Merchants shout prices, hawkers roast chestnuts, and calligraphers daub labels on bolts in ink so black it seems to swallow the silk's sheen. A mainstream fact, Song-era market records list over 200 varieties of silk cloth gauze, satin, damask, each prized for certain embroidery qualities. Historians still argue whether these varieties emerged from deliberate imperial standards or organically from local weavers experimenting. But either way, there was no shortage of choices. You follow a silk trader named Zheng Hua as he negotiates for a particularly fine weight of silk gauze dyed deep purple, a hue reserved for high-born families, thanks to rare Malarut dye imported from a quirky detail. Fringe tales say some merchants mixed in crushed snail shells to achieve an iridescent sheen, believing the snail's spiral shells symbolized an unending lotus spiral. You pursed your lips at the image of snail shell flecks in your favorite evening gown, but this odd practice speaks to how deeply symbolism and commerce intertwined. Loading the purple gauze onto longshoremen leaning over the Grand Canal, you board a wooden barge gliding under moonlit arch bridges towards Suzhou, the heart of silk embroidery. The water laps softly, maybe you'll drift off imagining the barge's gentle sway, and you watch as the bargemen stack crates labeled Wei He Hua Seliao for lotus suit materials beside crates of blue-green indigo dye. A mainstream fact, canals linked Hangzhou, Suzhou, and Nanjing into a silk production triangle, enabling rapid distribution of materials. Historians still argue whether these waterways were engineered primarily for grain shipments or deliberately expanded to boost the lucrative silk trade, but your barge ride feels deliberate, as if silk was destiny's cargo. In Suzhou, the scene shifts to dimly lit workshops where women bent over half-finished lotus shoes, their nimble fingers threading silk strands through tiny eyelets. You step inside, feeling immediately cocooned by the hiss of spinning machines and the rustle of silk bolts. A quirky tidbit. Some guilds claimed their embroidery studios sat atop ancient dragons' veins lay lines of geomancer, believing these mystical lines imparted extra auspicious energy to every stitch. You tilt your head, picturing a silk workshop on a dragon's backbone, and can't help smiling at the blend of superstition and craftsmanship. You approach a master shoemaker who presents you with raw materials, bundles of silk thread coiled like giant springs, bits of padded cotton, and a stack of pre-cut leather, sole-softened pigskin, treated to be as thin as rice paper yet strong enough to support the bound arch. A mainstream fact, leather soles and lotus shoes were sometimes laminated with mulberry bark glue for extra strength without added bulk. Historians still argue whether leather or silk soles were preferred by court ladies or peasant brides, but your guide swears by pigskin's durability under silk embroidery. Turning to the embroidery bench, you see patterns sketched on paper, intricate lotus and crane motifs, phoenix and peony designs, all originally inspired by court paintings. You dip your finger in a pot of vibrant red dye and swirl it over a silk thread, guiding it through a needle with steady precision. The master observes, silk's natural elasticity must be respected. Pull too tightly and the thread will snap. You feel the tension between fragility and resilience, a fitting metaphor for bound feet themselves. Watching the artisan at work, you notice the slight curve in each shoe frame, calculated to match the 3-inch golden lotus ideal. Fringe historians whisper that some workshops secretly engineered slight metal springs into the midsole, so the wearer would have a softer bounce with every step. You raise an eyebrow at the proto-sneaker concept, but that tiny spring idea would certainly cushion the pain if only it existed beyond rumor. As twilight falls, you visit a shipping outpost where newly finished lotus shoes are crated for transport back to the capital. You watch a line of workers packing silk-wrapped shoes into lacquered boxes, each box lined with paper soaked in oil to repel insects, an essential step, since camphor deters moths that could feast on valuable silk. A mainstream fact, household ledgers from the Qing period mentioned camphor oil as a standard preservative for luxury textiles. Scholars still argue whether camphor's medicinal connotations purifying evil spirits were as significant as its practical use. But your box snaps shut with scented assurance. Your final scene is a midnight banquet in Kaifeng where the silk arrives just in time for new wedding ceremonies. Courtiers marvel at the shoes, inspecting stitches under lamplight, while poets compose impromptu verses praising the silken arches that outshine the moon. You listen as the room hushes, voices dipping so low it feels like a secret shared only among those who know how much toil each stitch required. You step outside into the cool night air, silk robe brushing the courtyard stones, and inhale the blended scents of dye vats, camphor and lotus incense. Recall the clattering bamboo wedges and indigo dye vats of rural villages, the jade rulers and matchmakers, scrolls of gated gardens, the ivory wedges and palace dancers of legend. All these thread silk trade, embroidery art, and bound feet, together a tapestry of pain and beauty, commerce and devotion, stretched across empire-spanning routes. Historians still argue whether the Silk Road's primary gift was cultural exchange or sheer economic incentive. But tonight, as you feel the smooth heft of silk bolts in your hands, you sense both forces at work. Human ambition woven into every filament. Let that recognition of silk's journey lull you. Caravans humming through deserts, barges drifting in moonlight, and artisans humming as they stitch. Your breath slows, mirroring the slow unspooling of silk thread, and you drift toward dreams stitched with golden lotus patterns. You wake to the soft drip of water from a carved stone basin outside your window, recalling the rustic indigo bindings and willow bark poultices from Section 8, and the velvet silk slippers of Section 6. Tonight, you're exploring the fringe, beliefs that transformed foot binding from mere cosmetic constraint into a supposed health remedy. Strange claims that binding could cure female weakness, calm the heart, and even ward off hysterical fits. A mainstream fact, imperial medical treatises from the Qing dynasty occasionally mention foot binding in passing, noting that moderate compression improved blood circulation in the lower limbs. Historians still argue whether these observations were genuine clinical assessments or post hoc justifications to reinforce the custom's legitimacy. And you probably won't survive picturing a Qing physician diagnosing your arch as a cardiovascular asset, but they truly believed in binding's restorative powers. You find yourself in a dimly lit apothecary. Rows of wooden drawers labeled with dried herbs and minerals. The air is heady with the scent of ginseng and powdered cinnamon bark. A placard on the wall cites a line from physician Li Shizhen's Compendium of Materia Medica, claiming that proper foot compression could ground the spirit, stabilizing the heart's key and thus cure palpitations. A fringe claim adds that binding encouraged meridian flow, aligning the body's energy channels like a well-tuned musical instrument. You imagine your own meridians as miniature silk threads, all perfectly stretched, and can't help smiling at the hybrid of bodily torture and holistic therapy. On a low wooden table lies an array of binding cloth samples, each dyed in different medicinal tints: safflower for warmth, chrysanthemum for coolness, and mint for clarity. A quirky detail. Some practitioners insisted on rotating cloth hues weekly according to traditional yang cycles: warm colors 1 week, cool the next, to balance internal humors. You'd treat your bedsheets that way if you believed crimson linens could soothe your insomnia. But here it's all part of the therapeutic choreography. The apothecary's keeper, a bespectacled woman with wisped-thin hairpins, gestures to a seated patient whose feet are wrapped in palliolo cloth. She explains that certain symptoms, dizziness, menstrual irregularities, emotional excess, were believed to stem from erratic blood flow in the feet. By binding the foot arch, tension was said to direct blood upward, preventing it from pooling in the lower limbs. A mainstream fact. Post-mortem reports from 18th century provincial hospitals noted fewer instances of lower leg edema among bound-foot women. Historians still argue whether that data reflects a genuine health benefit or simply a statistical fluke compounded by selective reporting. You lean close as the keeper squeezes a drop of herbal liniment onto her palm-white peony root, prepared according to a family recipe, and rubs it gently into the girl's bound instep. The cool, slightly bitter oil seeps through layers of cloth. A fringe anecdote tells of a madam in Guangzhou who massaged lotus leaf extract into bindings to treat female hysterics, believing the lotus's purity dissolved mental turbulence. You wonder if dabbling in lotus oil could calm your own racing thoughts late at night, or if it would just send your bedsheets next. The keeper demonstrates a rare binding variant, the Phoenix cocoon wrap, involving additional layers at the heel and ankle meant to stabilize the entire leg. She claims it cured a local magistrate's niece of chronic fainting once bound. The girl reportedly rose from swooning fits. A mainstream fact. Family memoirs record cases where girls prone to dizzy spells seemed steadier after bindings, though some scholars argue these anecdotes were romanticized to defend the custom. Historians still debate whether neurological conditions were genuinely alleviated or if social expectations simply framed binding as a panacea for any woman's malady behind you. A framed certificate gilt with dragons proclaims the apothecary's recognition by the Imperial Medical Board. It reads, "Certified practitioner of bone setting and foot key harmonization." You trace the stylized characters with your finger in Chakaloof. Never needed a lesson in foot key harmony to stub your toe twice today. A low bench against the wall displays a collection of porcelain cups painted with swirling lotus motifs. The keeper lifts one and pours a milky white tonic, crushed pearl powder, deer antler shavings, and steeped jasmine petals. Foot bath before binding, she instructs. You inhale its sweet earthy aroma, imagining soaking your own bound feet in that concoction. A fringe note says the pearl powder brightened the skin, giving the foot a luminescent sheen under lantern light. Beauty and remedy in one bowl. You'd add crushed pearl to your skincare routine if it didn't cost an emperor's ransom. As the boots of binding masters click on the tiled floor, she recounts visiting far-flung villages where elders claimed binding rooted a woman's soul to her home, curing homesickness and preventing wanderlust. You blink at the absurd idea of binding as cure for travel fever. Stay put or your toes revolt. But it underscores how multifaceted these beliefs became. Nearby, a wooden chart lists ailments and recommended binding strengths: light for nervous temperament, medium for respiratory weakness, and extra tight for spinal disorders. Each category matches specific herbal additives in the binding paste. A mainstream fact. County records from Zhejiang mention binding sessions tailored to a girl's constitution, with doctors prescribing tea blends alongside cloth. Historians still argue whether these prescriptions were medical necessities or mere smoke and mirrors to bolster the healer's authority. You settle onto a cushioned stool, toes suspended in midair as the keeper selects fresh cloth. She examines previous binding marks: redness indicating poor circulation, bluish hues warning of stagnation, and nods. Then, she tightens the new strip, whispering a healing mantra: "May your lotus halo protect your heart and root your spirit." The rhythmic tightening feels oddly hypnotic. The mantra a lullaby you almost believe. In the corner, a dusty shelf holds volumes of medical case studies, the pages yellowed and annotated. One passage describes a patient whose chronic palpitations ceased within a month of binding. Another details a woman who credited her binding for recovering postpartum strength. Yet a side note in red ink protests. Sample size too small. Symptoms subjective. Historians still dispute whether these case studies reflect real medical trials or propaganda to sustain social traditions. As you lean back, you feel the soft resistance of cloth against bone and embrace that, depending on view, could be nurturing or tyrannical. Fringe voices maintain that binding aligned the spine, preventing female curvature common among unbound women who performed heavy labor. A mainstream fact. Provincial health surveys recorded fewer back spasms among gentry women, but critics point to underreporting among peasant women too busy with fieldwork to note such spasms. Historians still argue whether binding's supposed skeletal benefits were myth or measured reality. A final belief, that the clack of lotus shoes on palace marble created sonic vibrations believed to expel evil spirits and cure wandering ghosts, soothing for both physical and metaphysical maladies. You smile at the multi-layered magic, a tap on the floor as potent as a healing spell. You rise, brushing imaginary dust from your silk skirt, and step outside into a courtyard now calm and shadowed. The keeper's low chant fades with the lantern light. You recall the rural mason tapping bamboo wedges, both affirmations of binding's medical promise and testaments to its cultural grip. Historians still argue whether these fringe health benefits were earnest medical theories or clever post hoc rationalizations to protect a cherished tradition. But for tonight, let the thought of jasmine and pearl footbaths, herbs ground into paste, and key harmonizing bands weave through your mind. Imagine your own arches gently cradled, your spirit soothed by cloth and chant, your heart's rhythm aligning with every tiny step, and as the courtyard fan hums its soft counterpoint, drift into sleep, believing you're both patient and practitioner in the most curious medical regimen history ever prescribed. You wake to the faint creak of a ship's timbers and the salty Thames of harbor fog drifting through your stateroom window far from jade gongs and indigo bindings. You're aboard a British steamer approaching Amoy in the late 19th century. Remember the jasmine baths and herbal pastes from Section 10. Tonight, you're stepping into the stiff collars and moral certainties of Western missionaries, clutching leather-bound journals filled with horrified sketches of bound feet. Their shock ripples through port towns like a gale, a mainstream fact. By the 1860s, numerous Western missionaries, including the ardent Scottish Dr. Peter Parker, published letters describing lotus feet as inhuman constriction and campaigned for Chinese reformers to end the practice. Historians still argue whether these accounts accurately captured widespread suffering or were tinted by cultural bias, and you probably won't survive picturing earnest Victorian ladies fainting at the first glimpse of a lotus shoe, but their reactions were that extreme. You step onto the humid wharf, boots sinking slightly into damp wooden planks, and hear the clip-clop of tiny silk slippers echoing against stone staircases. Two female missionaries, stiff-waisted and crinoline, stride past, gasping as they pass a group of bound-foot women carrying baskets of seaweed. Fringe memoirs claim one missionary attempted to measure a bound-foot's length in public, causing a scandal among local magistrates who demanded an apology. You smirk at the absurd formalities of polite outrage, imagining her pulling out a brass ruler at a temple festival. These women scribble fervently in their diaries, describing lotus feet as both pitiable and grotesque. You can almost taste the ink's metallic temps as they record blister patterns and gait limps with Victorian precision. A quirky detail: some missionaries compared the bound foot's shape to a lobster claw, then organized fancy-dressed footballs back in London where guests paid admission to dance barefoot in solidarity. You'd RSVP maybe if they promised tea, but you'd definitely pass on the lobster claw imagery. Inside a missionary compound, you're ushered into a dim parlor where embroidered samplers and bound-foot shoes are displayed like macabre curiosities. An English woman in spectacles offers you a cup of lukewarm tea scented with lemongrass rather than jasmine. She worked too hard to steam koi ponds, she explains. You gingerly set the cup on a lace-topped side table carved with rose motifs, noting how out of place the lotus shoes look amid chintz upholstery. A mainstream fact: many missionary societies collected lotus shoes as trophies, later shipping them back to Europe as evidence of Chinese barbarism. Historians still argue whether these collections fueled sensationalist propaganda or fostered genuine cross-cultural empathy. From behind a lace curtain, you overhear heated debate. We must enlighten them. Pronouns as a preacher voice echoing off mahogany walls. Our duty is Christian charity, retorts a younger sister, her bonnet askew. The moral fervor is intoxicating, almost as potent as the faint whiff of camphor oil clinging to the shoes on display. A fringe note suggests some missionaries sprinkled salt around their shoes' display cases to preserve the relics, believing salt held protective powers against both moths and moral decay. You grin at the notion of salted shoe relics warding off both insects and sin. They pass around pamphlets printed in both English and Romanized Chinese, arguing that foot binding equates to bloody bondage and citing gruesome personal testimonies. You trace the pamphlet's typeface with your fingertip blackletter for English, delicate script for Chinese, and feel the weight of words meant to shame an entire culture. A mainstream fact: by 1902, missionary-led societies had established over 50-foot emancipation societies across southern China. Scholars still debate whether these societies empowered local women or inadvertently branded them as backward in the eyes of their own communities. You wander out into the courtyard, where a teenage convert named Malinga Girl, whose feet were recently unbound, practices walking unreinforced on garden stones. You will recall May from Section 8, though her ankle scars look different now, softened by weeks of massage. She staggers forward, arms pinned to her sides like a debutante, learning to curtsy, eyes bright with newfound relief. A quirky tidbit: some former binders taught missionaries secret untying knots patterns, thought too shameful for public display, so women could practice unbinding in secret before revealing newfound mobility. As dusk falls, the resident medical missionary sets up a makeshift clinic beneath an oil lamp. You watch as she inspects a girl's dusty leggings for open sores, cleaning them with boiled tea leaves and improvised antiseptic. A mainstream fact: Missionaries often combine Western dressings with local herbal poultices, blending to medical traditions and fraught collaboration. Historians still argue whether these hybrid treatments genuinely reduced infection or simply served as a pragmatic bridge to convert patients to Christianity. Inside the clinic, a local doctor trained at a missionary hospital debates theology. With the head nurse, binding is a sin against the Creator's design, he states. She counters, our culture's fabric is woven differently. Let us amend gently. You lean against a wooden bench, feeling the grain under your fingertips. As cultural and moral dialogues swirl like incense smoke, you chuckle. Who knew footbinding could spark heated theology classes? In a quieter moment, you're shown an illustrated tract depicting a bound-foot girl ascending to heaven on lotus petals, a missionary's artistic allegory of liberation. The sketch is earnest, if heavy-handed, petals lifting her above broken bindings, symbolizing spiritual emancipation. A fringe footnote. Some missionary artists included hidden Chinese characters in their sketches, subtle pleas for cultural respect, hoping to soften their critique. You admire the tact, even as you wince at the didactic message. Later, at a candlelit gathering of converts, you hear a former bound-foot woman stand and speak in halting English-accented Mandarin. Walked too long in pain. Now I walk by faith. Her voice quivers like a lotus blossom and when fragile yet defiant. A mainstream fact. Many early converts shared testimonies of physical and spiritual healing after unbinding, which missionaries compiled into inspirational booklets. Scholars still argue whether these stories were genuine accounts or patterned narratives designed for fundraising back home. As the candles gutter, you stroll back through the compound's low archway into the muggy night. The scent of church incense mingles with the faint aroma of lotus paste carried on the breeze. You reflect on the missionaries' zeal, sometimes clumsy, often compassionate, and forever altering the dialogue around footbinding. Their shock became a catalyst, thrusting the practice into global limelight and fueling Chinese reformers' own debates. You pause by a lotus pond shimmering under lantern light, recalling the water basin mirrors in Section 5 and the silk roots of Section 9. The contrast between cultural pride and foreign judgment hums in the air. Historians still argue whether missionary interventions accelerated the end of footbinding or simply added another layer of cultural imperialism. But tonight, let their earnest outrage and heartfelt clinics drift through your thoughts like petals on water, complex, contradictory, and strangely soothing. As you sink into sleep, allow the images of gasping ladies in crinolines, display cases, and converted women learning to walk afresh to mingle with jasmine tea dreams. The moral tug-of-war fades into a gentle lullaby of shared humanity and cross-cultural curiosity. And as the harbor fog settles, let the memory of missionary shock echo softly, guiding you toward rest. You wake to the rustle of yellowed pages and the faint scent of aged ink. Tonight, you're leafing through classical Chinese literature where lotus feet click across verse and prose, echoing rituals you've witnessed in Sections 2 and 3. Imagine yourself seated at a low scholar's desk, warm oil lamp casting dancing shadows on scrolls decorated with elegant calligraphy. A mainstream fact. One of the earliest literary references to footbinding appears in the Tangiera anecdote collection, Yijianzi, which briefly mentions delicate bound feet admired by courtiers. Historians still argue whether these fleeting mentions reflect actual practice or are later interpolations by editors seeking to dramatize female beauty. But here, the words themselves shimmer with possibility. You unroll a scroll of song poetry. A line leaps out. Her steps are lotus petals, unfolding one by one upon jade. The archaism vibrates in your ears like a soft chant. Fringe scholars suggest this particular poem might have originally described a dancer's fan technique, later reinterpreted to glorify bound feet, a tale of poetic retrofitting. You grin at the idea, standing at a modern open mic night, someone reciting fan choreography as a footbinding ode. Yet the metaphor sticks, coloring centuries of beauty ideals. As the lamp flickers, you turn to a Yuan dynasty play script where the heroine Yuji reveals her bound feet beneath a lotus-embroidered hem. In one act she steps gracefully upon broken pottery shards, symbolizing both fragility and resolve. A quirky tidbit. Some rare editions of the playstage directions specify that a porcelain shard should tactfully crackle underfoot for dramatic effect. You nearly laugh at the stagecraft ingenuity, minimalist prop design, maximum symbolism, but the effect must have been haunting in candlelight. Sipping a cup of jasmine tea, flip to a Ming Dynasty novel describing a footbinding contest in a tea house where concubines compare lotus bloom curves beneath gauzy screens. A mainstream fact. Texts like The Plum in the Golden Vase include footbinding scenes to critique excesses of elite women. Historians still argue whether these passages intend satirical condemnation or sly celebration, but you feel the tension in every line. Silk hem rustles, soft laughter, the hush when one challenger unveils her perfect arch, a whisper of incense, drifts through your mind, recalling the muggy missionary clinic in Section 11. Blending with the cold midnight blue ink on these pages, you note a fringe commentary claiming that some critics of the novel inserted footbinding scenes to undermine the author's reputation, hinting at editorial tampering. You imagine shadowy scriptoriums where officials gather to tweak scandalous details, like medieval gossip bloggers rewriting each other's posts. Next, you explore local folk ballads collected in rural One evocative verse laments 8 springs she saw, 8 springs she bound, till petals of youth lay crumpled in ground. The sorrowful refrain echoes the palpable pain you felt in sections 3 and 4. A mainstream fact: oral storytellers often used these ballads to caution young girls against premature binding. Historians still argue whether such ballads were widely circulated or limited to subversive circles. But you can almost hear a mother's voice quivering beside a hearth as she sings the warning. Under the glow of your lamp, you reach for a small anthology of women's poetry from the late Qing period. A poem by Lin Taiyu reads, "At moon's hush I unwrap my crimson coils, aching for dawn's free earth." The lines resonate with your own mental unbinding at day's end. Fringe analysis suggests Lin's poem was originally penned as a political allegory on imperial decline, only later adopted by anti-binding reformers as a rallying cry. You smirk at the repurposing political protest, turned bedroom lament. You sip a drop of rose-scented water from a porcelain cup so redolent of the crimson slippers in section 6 and turn to an 18th century anthology of moral tales. Here, a cautionary story describes a beauty named Peony who boasts of her lotus steps until a monk foretells her feet will become thorns of karmic debt. The tale ends with Peony renouncing bindings and meditating on pains and permanence. A mainstream fact: didactic stories like these were taught in girls' schools to temper vanity. Scholars still debate whether they had real influence or were mere classroom filler, but you feel the moral instruction in each word as you nibble a rice cake dusted with plum sugar. Recalling Section 3's feast scenes, you uncover a fringe journal tucked between the scrolls. It's the memoir of a courtesan who secretly penned foot-binding instructions into her calligraphy practice, encrypting them as elegant flourishes. The memoir claims these hidden strokes formed a clandestine guide passed among women. Chuckle at the stealth. A beauty manual disguised as penmanship practice. Write your way to perfect lotus arches. And you admire the ingenuity. You pause to reflect on the delicate balance between praise and critique. Foot binding in literature served as a double-edged motif, a symbol of ethereal grace, yet a mirror reflecting societal constraints. A mainstream fact: by the early 20th century, many modern Chinese writers like Lu Zhong depicted bound feet as oppressive relics, using them to critique feudal traditions. Historians still argue whether such portrayals sparked widespread reform or merely articulated urban intellectual sentiment. But you sense the power of the pen pressing against silk and flesh alike. You sense the hush of critics debating in tea, insisting foot binding is a poetic curse, others praising it as wicked beauty's crown. These literary debates echo the heated medical and moral discussions from sections 10 and 11. As your eyelids grow heavy, you recall the clandestine embroidery codes from section 14, now transposed into poetic metaphors, tiny silk symbols becoming allegories for hidden longing and resistance. The final scroll you unfurl is a 1910 novella recounting a foot-binding parlor transformed into a modern embroidery school, its former binders now teaching needlework to unbound girls. The protagonist muses, "I stitch patterns to weave freedom into cloth." A mainstream fact: after binding's abolition, many former binders did repurpose their skills into decorative embroidery. Historians still debate whether this transition offered genuine economic independence or simply replaced one form of confinement with another. But the novella's hopeful tone hums like a lullaby. You close the anthology with a gentle thud, feeling the weight of words as real as the silk slippers you handled. The lamp's glow softens, and you let the literary mosaic settle. Poems praising click-click elegance, novels critiquing hollow beauty, folk ballads lamenting broken bones, and modern tales envisioning liberation through art. Historians still argue whether literature influenced foot binding's rise and fall or merely reflected existing cultural currents. But tonight, let these words, both adoration and admonition, rock you toward rest. As the ink fades in your dreams, imagine scrolls unfurling like petals, each line a step in the endless dance between constraint and expression. And as you drift away, may the hushed cadence of ancient verse carry you gently into sleep. You awaken to the muted toll of a palace bell echoing through lacquered halls. Recall the lantern-lit clinics of section 10 and the missionary pamphlets fluttering in section 11. Tonight, you slip into the heart of the Qing dynasty's power, where imperial edicts shaped foot-binding's fate. You stand before thick crimson doors carved with dragon scales, awaiting the decree that will decree who binds and who unbinds it. Mainstream fact: in 1648, the Shunzi Emperor's court issued an early edict sternly praising bound feet as a mark of Han identity and urging officials' households to enforce the practice. Historians still argue whether these edicts aimed to solidify ethnic distinction after Manchu conquest or to reassure conservative Confucian elites, but either way, you probably won't survive picturing imperial mandarins inspecting girls' bindings before granting office promotions. You imagine walking through a marble-cobbled courtyard, the Empress Dowager Cixi's portrait gazing down on you from a gilded screen. In 1881, Cixi quietly endorsed a gradual relaxation of binding rules, allowing minor unbinding for education and light work. A fringe tidbit suggests she personally ordered her lady-in-waiting to unbind one foot to test how quickly she could. Pen Edict's legend says the edict arrived in 3 days with a perfect arch flourished in Cixi's own handwriting. You chuckle at the image of the Empress scribbling with one liberated foot tapping impatiently onto soaring rafters. You join courtiers gathered for a reading of the latest imperial rescript. The Grand Secretary intones, "Henceforth, bound feet shall no longer be mandatory for those in Han official ranks." You crane your neck, picturing silk fans whispering in excitement. A mainstream fact, by 1901, the Qing government had issued multiple gentle reminders discouraging binding in imperial schools and government offices. Historians still debate whether these were serious attempts at reform or symbolic gestures, meant to placate foreign critics like a polite bow before tightening the knot again. You slip into a corridor hung with framed edicts, each scroll dated and sealed with laconic red stamps. One reads, "Girls of the imperial clan may henceforth walk unshackled, provided they maintain decorum." You tap the lacquer frame, feeling the swirl of reform and tradition locked in tension. An embroidered cushion beneath a nearby footrest staying back to Section 6's lotus shoes signals the palace's readiness to accommodate unbound feet at court functions. In a hushed side chamber, eunuchs read aloud petitions from provincial governors pleading for retention of binding to preserve social order. They fear that unbound women might outrun sedan chairs or neglect domestic virtues. A quirky detail. Some local magistrates reported clandestine binding inspectors who measured girls at markets, finding families who dared ease their daughters' wraps. These inspectors carried bamboo calipers like medieval parking enforcers, meting out foot tickets to errant parents. You smirk at that image of a bamboo caliper levying fines your daughter's arch exceeds 3 inches. Pay up or bind tighter. The debate simmers. Does relaxing binding empower women or erode moral discipline? Historians still argue whether Cixi's reforms reflected genuine concern for women's welfare or a calculated response to mounting foreign pressure and internal reformist movements. You recall the heated court debates echoing the moral dialogues of Section 11's missionary clinic, though here the voices are hushed by protocol and silk robes. At dusk, you attend a palace drama reenacting Cixi's edicts, actors in elaborate robes declaiming lines about filial piety and bodily autonomy. The heroine, a young Manchu princess, removes one binding in a tearful scene symbolizing a new era. Fringe accounts say Cixi staged these performances herself to gauge noble families' reactions. If the audience wept, she knew hearts were ready for change. You nearly laugh at this political theater. Next up, foot-binding improv workshop, but acknowledge its subtle power. Outside the palace gates, crowds clutch printed broadsheets announcing the reforms. You push through tea houses, where scholars recite essays praising heaven's mercy and unbinding. A mainstream fact. Street pamphlets from 1903 in Shanghai feature heated essays both for and against the imperial decrees, reflecting intense public discourse. Historians still debate whether urban literati or rural masses drove the push for unbinding, but the clamor in tea houses and publishing shacks suggests a tide turning. You wander into an official school courtyard, where girls practice calligraphy with unbound feet beneath their desks for the first time. A quirky anecdote recalls one teacher warning, "Don't let your feet wander like idle thoughts," a pun lost on most students but causing fits of giggles. You grin remembering the wrist rests from Section 5's scribe sessions. Now feet, to have freedom to wander without cloth constraints. As moonlight bathes the Nanjing city walls, you overhear a retired foot-binding master lamenting the loss of true lotus grace, but conceding that unbound feet might be healthier for daughters. Yet fringe traditionalists secretly continued binding in hidden parlors, citing ancestral piety. You picture secret women's sanctuarized dimly lit rooms where cloth still spirals toward ankles in defiance of edicts. The final imperial proclamation arrives in handscroll form. Let families decide freely, but let no soul suffer in silence. It's a compromise honoring both tradition and progress. A mainstream fact, after the 1911 revolution toppled the Qing bindings, abolition became law in the new republic. Historians still argue whether the fall of the dynasty or earlier imperial edicts played the pivotal role in ending binding, but tonight, let that legal unraveling echo like loosening cloth in your mind. You sink onto a silk-upholstered chaise, in Cixi's former retreat, fingers grazing unbound slippers at your feet so different from the ivory caliper inspections of old. You reflect on how decrees written in dragon scripts reshaped women's lives, guiding centuries of pain and, at last, opening the path to relief. Historians still argue whether imperial edicts were reluctant admissions of inevitability or genuine acts of compassion. But as you release your own toes beneath soft silk, feel the weight of those official scrolls lift. Let the image of crimson seals and bamboo calipers fade into a softer glow, and drift towards sleep knowing that laws, like bindings, can tighten or loosen with time. You awaken to the soft click of tiny needles slipping through silk rickle, the crimson slippers and lavish embroidery from section 6. Tonight, you're unraveling the secret codes woven into lotus shoes, those hidden stitch patterns women used to whisper desires or defy authority beneath delicate floor. Imagine yourself seated at a low, lacquered table, a single oil lamp, casting a golden pool of light over a smooth wooden surface strewn with miniature shoes and scraps of embroidered cloth. A mainstream fact. During the late Qing period, some women began incorporating discrete symbols, hearts, paired dragons, interlocking knots into the floral motifs on their lotus shoes. Historians still argue whether these emblems primarily signaled romantic intentions or served as family crests disguised in needlework. You probably won't survive picturing every rose stitch as a secret love letter, but these tiny symbols turned each shoe into a personal dossier passed from foot to foot. You pick up a pale green slipper embroidered with lotus petals and shimmering silver thread. Beneath a swirl of petal-edged stitches, you notice a hidden motif to parallel diagonal bars, stitched in contrasting crimson. Fringe accounts claim this pattern read as "Release me," a subtle plea to loosening binds when the opportunity arose. You chuckle at the boldness, "Release me," emblazoned on the sole, but imagine a lover's discovering that secret code and nodding in solemn agreement before midnight. Unbindings. As you lean closer, you spot an even subtler detail, tiny interlaced bamboo leaves stitched in muted gold at the heel. A quirky tidbit. Some women use bamboo motifs to symbolize resilience and quiet rebellion. Since bamboo bends but does not break, just like their bones under binding cloth. You shiver at the metaphor, picturing your own ankles bending like slender bamboo culms in a storm, yet returning upright each dawn. On the table lies a small, unassuming linen patch embroidered with a single phoenix feather among peonies, a mainstream fact. The phoenix often symbolized female transformation and renewal, suggesting that the wearer sought personal rebirth beyond societal constraints. Historians still argue whether phoenix stitches appeared organically in folk workshops or were deliberately taught in clandestine sisterhoods formed in tea houses. You sigh, imagining secret embroidery salons where women gathered by candlelight, trading codebooks along with tea leaves. You trace a spiral of gold thread embroidered into the shoe's arc, a signature known among courtiers as the whisper spiral. Fringe lore contends that this code promised silence and discretion, a promise that any shared secret, be it romantic or political, would remain buried beneath layers of cloth. You smirk, envisioning a rebellious young poet slipping a note into a slipper, confident the whisper spiral would keep it secret from prying eyes. "She, the dog, won't bark," you mutter. Next, you hold a lipstick red shoe embroidered with mango blossoms, an unusual motif outside southern provinces. A quirky detail, mango blossoms represented forbidden sweetness, a nod to women's unspoken appetites. In some regions, lovers matched blossoms on shoes if two women wore the same blossom pattern. They were rumored to be in a secret pact of friendship or clandestine love. You giggle at the idea of a friendship bracelet, circa 1900 China, sewn into footwear. You rotate the slipper, discovering a discrete cluster of 3 dots stitched behind the toe seam. A mainstream fact. 3-dot patterns often signified solidarity among foot-binding survivors, a symbol adopted by early anti-binding reform groups to identify each other covertly. Historians still argue whether this emblem emerged from reformist pamphlets or grassroots initiatives among former binders themselves. You nod, contemplating how a single dot could evolve into a silent handshake among comrades in needle and cloth. As the lamp's wick crackles, you notice a barely visible line of half-cross stitches tracing the shoe opening. This half-cross pattern, according to fringe sources, was code for "await the signal," a plea for secret midnight gatherings where unbinding instructions were shared. You imagine a moonlit courtyard filled with hushed whispers and the gentle rustle of silk, as women exchanged binding knots and untying techniques by flickering lantern light. Leaning back, you sip a cup of rosehip tea, recalling the fragrant foot baths of Section 10, letting its warm tartness soothe your tongue. On the table lies a pair of tiny silk ribbons embroidered with subtle arrowheads pointing inward toward the heel. A quirky anecdote suggests these arrowhead stitches directed a confidante's fingers to a hidden knot trapdoor. A final release point that, once found, allowed garments to slip free. You nearly spill your tea, imagining shoes rigged like secret passageways in an adventure novel. Beside the ribbons rests a scrap of cloth embroidered with checkerboard squares in pastels. A mainstream fact. Checkerboard patterns indicated strategic patience, symbolizing a woman's readiness to play the long game, whether in love, family politics, or reformist zeal. Historians still debate whether these patterns were a form of proto-feminist messaging or simply artistic whims. You grin at the board game metaphor, checkmate, binding. Your eyes drift to a battered embroidery guidebook with dog-eared pages. Inside, indistinct illustrations show 20+ hidden codes, complete with stitch diagrams. Fringe commentary claims this guide passed between families as heirloom, a secret manual ensuring daughters learned both binding and subversion together. You stroke a page depicting entwined cranes, a symbol of mutual devotion, half laughing, half in awe of how coded love could blossom in the tightest confines. As your eyelids grow heavy, you ponder the paradox. Tools of restraint transformed into vehicles of freedom and resistance. Historians still argue whether embroidery codes materially aided unbinding efforts or simply provided emotional solace, but you feel their weight in every stitch. These tiny symbols whispered courage, longing, and solidarity into the silent chambers of silk slippers. Before you drift away, imagine the clandestine rhythm of needles clicking code beneath silk petals, messages folded into fabric like letters in a safe. Let the hidden symbols release me. Bars, whisper spirals, phoenix feathers fade into your mind's tapestry as lullabies of quiet rebellion. And as the oil lamp gutters final glow, feel those secret stitches guide you toward dreams of freedom softly sewn. You awaken to the gentle drone of a scholar's lecture echoing through a high-ceilinged study. Recall the secret embroidery codes of Section 14 and the imperial edicts of Section 13. Tonight, you settle into a lacquered armchair beside a low table strewn with academic journals and scrolls, debating why, exactly, women endured such lifelong discomfort for the sake of tiny feet. The scene feels like a symposium, but filtered through the soft glow of a paper lantern and the lingering hum of your bedside fan. At mainstream fact, modern scholarship notes that foot binding persisted for nearly a millennium, with prevalence rates among Han Chinese women reaching upwards of 90% in some regions well into the 19th century. Historians still argue whether this endurance stemmed primarily from genuine personal desire to embody prevailing beauty ideals or from deeper structural pressures within a patriarchal society. You probably won't survive picturing entire generations of women calmly accepting bone-crushing pain as a daily routine, but they did. You lean forward to examine one scroll, its title emblazoned in elegant characters, Lotus Feet as Cultural Capital. The author argues that bound feet functioned as a form of social currency essential for securing advantageous marriages, elevating family standing, and signaling refined upbringing. According to this view, women traded bodily comfort for long-term socio-economic security. Fringe critics counter that some families bound daughters' feet not out of choice but fear of social exclusion, effectively imprisoning children in painful beauty prisons. You feel a twinge of reader curiosity. Were women active agents in their own binding, or passive victims of societal choreography? On your right, a fringe journal propped open claims that foot binding offered women a rare locus of control over their bodies and identities. These scholars cite anecdotal diaries where binders describe feeling uniquely womanly when their arches tightened, as if pain conferred membership in an exclusive sisterhood. You can almost see the tear-stained pages of those diaries, each entry a quiet manifesto. Through suffering I claim my womanhood, a quirky detail. One such diary recounts a woman gifting her husband a pair of miniature lotus shoes as proof of her virtue, a ritual you can't help but find both touching and tragic, a perfect testament to the practice's paradox. As the fan's hum syncs with your breath, you reach for a heavier volume. Physiological impacts of binding. Its diagrams show how chronic arch collapse altered gait, posture, and muscle distribution. A mainstream fact. Studies confirm that women with bound feet experience lifelong ailments, chronic back pain, pelvic misalignment, and increased risk of arthritis. Historians still debate whether these health consequences significantly shortened lifespans or if other factors like improved nutrition or better living conditions played a larger role in women's overall longevity. You flex your toes under the sheets, grateful you never had to test that hypothesis firsthand. You shift your gaze to a small pamphlet tucked between scrolls, titled Beauty and Agency. It highlights cases where women reportedly chose to continue binding despite emancipation laws, clinging to the ritual as a form of heritage. Fringe whispers claim some elderly women refused to unbind, insisting their lotus feet were treasured sculptures signifying personal sacrifice. You imagine a room full of hardened elders polishing their lotus shoes at dusk, murmuring, "This pain is my story." A scholarly debate phrase floats to mind. Historians still argue whether these late-life choices represented genuine affection for tradition or internalized oppression. Beside you, a teacup steams gently, its aroma reminding you of the jasmine and chrysanthemum baths from sections 3 and 10. You take a sip, letting the warmth anchor you as the debate deepens. Under the lamp, you notice a chart comparing binding practices across regions, China's south versus its north, showing variations in tightness, duration, and social ritual. A mainstream fact. In coastal provinces, looser bindings were more common, reflecting different local tastes and economic factors. Historians still argue whether these regional variations indicate women's agency molding the practice to their needs, or simply adaptations to environmental and cultural conditions. Your eyes drift to a final stack of papers, Emotion and Embodiment. This field examines how boundfoot women describe their bodily experiences in letters and poetry, often using garden metaphors, walks through moonlit orchards, petals falling softly, pain as gentle dew, a quirky detail. One letter likened morning, unbinding to opening a bud at dawn, evoking both beauty and relief. You almost sigh aloud at the poetic resilience, sensing how women reframed agony into artful narrative as your eyelids grow heavy. You reflect on the tangled arguments: beauty as capital, pain as agency, health as cost, tradition as comfort. Historians still argue whether foot-binding primarily empowered women by granting social capital or enslaved them under rigid aesthetic codes. You sense neither side holds sole truth. Rather, the reality lies in the friction between choice and coercion, desire and duty. Let that friction lull you now. The image of women stepping like lotus petals on stone floors, their arches both a triumph of aesthetic discipline and a testament to bodily sacrifice. Feel the scholarly debate swirl around you like incensed smoke, complex, unresolved, and hauntingly beautiful. As the fan whispers on and the lantern's glow dims, drift towards sleep, embraced by the knowledge that history's great debates, much like foot-binding itself, are stitched together by countless, often contradictory human threads. You awaken to the soft clamor of powdered women's slippers, clicking against polished sidewalks far removed from the codified debates in Section 15's step into the stirring dawn of early 20th century China, where reformers, feminists, and missionaries converge in earnest campaigns to end the age-old practice of foot-binding. Imagine yourself on a bustling street in Shanghai, posters plastered to walls proclaiming, "Gave of freedom, unbind for freedom," while young activists in Western-style dress distribute pamphlets beneath paper lanterns. A mainstream fact. By 1904, over 46-foot emancipation societies had formed in major cities like Shanghai, Tianjin, and Guangzhou, uniting Chinese and foreign reformers to lobby provincial assemblies for binding bans. Historians still argue whether these societies achieved their success primarily through grassroots mobilization or by leveraging elite connections. Either way, you probably won't survive picturing reformers on street corners arguing over pamphlet slogans at dawn, but they really did. You follow a slender woman named Qiu Jin, revolutionary poet and self-styled dragon tamer, as she addresses a crowd of university students in Shanghai's Shui district. Dressed in black trousers for mobility, she brandishes a bound-foot shoe as a rallying symbol, her voice rising. "These tiny shackles steal your promise of tomorrow." A fringe account suggests Qiu Jin once burned 3 pairs of lotus shoes on stage during a poetry recital, showering sparks into the dim hall. You can almost smell the acrid smoke and hear gasps. Performance art as protested, the image endures as one of defiant theater. Turning a corner, you pass a foreign missionaries' schoolyard where girls giggle as they compare newly unbound feet, ready to learn Western calisthenics instead of limping rituals. A mainstream fact. American and British missionaries, emboldened by earlier shock over missionary clinics, Section 11 funded evening classes teaching hygiene, literacy, and the philosophy of bodily autonomy to former binders. Historians still debate whether missionary involvement empowered women with practical tools or inadvertently imposed Western values under the guise of charity. But the foreign-funded programs undeniably bolstered anti-binding momentum. Further down the street, a troop of young students roll out a large scroll painted with the slogan "Women's Liberation and National Prosperity" above a stylized map of a modern China with no foot-binding depiction. A quirky detail: some activists used lithographic presses to produce foot-binding political cartoons. Imagine cartoons mocking lotus steps as backward waltzes, and smuggled them into rural towns in tea caddies. You can almost giggle at the absurdity. Sipping tea while reading revolutionary political caricatures of bound feet, you duck into a discreet meeting room beneath a lacquered tea house where female educators and male intellectuals of the 100 Days Reform era revive their vows to eradicate foot-binding as part of a broader modernization agenda. A mainstream fact. Kong Yue and Liang Cheqiao publicly denounced foot-binding in their reformist journals as emblematic of China's feudal mire. Historians still argue whether their scathing essays truly swayed common opinion or preached to an already converted urban elite. But these essays circulated widely among student circles. At a long wooden table, you find stacks of banned underground pamphlets titled "Jaifon Lamboard Liberate Lotus Steps," printed in secret presses in Japanese-occupied areas. You handle one. Its title page shows a bound foot split open like a blossoming flower, red silk petals scattering into ink. A fringe rumor says these pamphlets included hidden worm-eaten pages coded to reveal clandestine unbinding workshops. You nearly gasp. Imagine a paste paper manual instructing midnight unbindings disguised as a children's storybook. You climb a rickety staircase to the second floor of a converted warehouse, hosting Shanghai's first women's congress. In 1907 delegates, missionary nurses, Qing-educated feminists, and working-class seamstresses around a petition urging the governor of Jiangsu to enforce binding bans under penalty of fines. A mainstream fact. Petitions with over 10,000 signatures reached provincial offices by late 1908, prompting at least one rural magistrate to issue binding bans in his jurisdiction. Historians still debate whether these legal pronouncements effected real change or simply drove the practice underground, but the speed of petition circulation was unprecedented. Outside, Street vendors hawk Jeffel juice, unbinding rice wine, said to strengthen muscles weakened by years of cloth compression. You sip a small cup, its warmth spreads through your limbs, and you momentarily envision tossing your own bindings into the alley. A quirky detail. Some taverns offered lotus liberation nights where patrons danced barefoot to celebrate reform victories. Imagine barefoot flappers shimmying under red lanterns, toasting social progress with unshackled feet. As dusk settles, you join a lantern procession through the French concession. Activists carrying painted silk lanterns shaped like tiny lotus shoes. They march past consulate gates, chanting, Shufu Jalbait Bushagorja Jabal, bound feet are no national treasure. A mainstream fact. Foreign diplomats sometimes joined these processions, their presence lending international pressure on Qing officials. Historians still argue whether Western endorsement legitimized the movement or fueled xenophobic backlash. But that night, the streets glowed with optimism. Entering a drawing room salon in the British concession, you listen as T. Yuanpei, future president of Peking University, delivers an oration on education and emancipation. He criticizes foot binding as antithetical to modern pedagogy and challenges the audience. Can a nation of bound-footed daughters stand tall among world powers? A fringe anecdote suggests TSI once recited Goethe in German to emphasize universal human rights. Imagine a mixed-language tirade punctuated by fervent singing of Die Freiheit, but his eloquence resonated, spurring student activists to form anti-binding leagues on campus. You step into a dim lecture hall at St. John's University, where Dr. Della Wells, an American physician, presents clinical evidence of bindings' long-term health costs, paired with statistics from Qing hospital records. She unrolls a graph showing infection rates and back pain incidents among bound-foot women versus unbound women. A mainstream fact. Dr. Wells's lectures, published in bilingual journals, reached over 5,000 readers across China by 1910. Historians still debate the statistical accuracy of her data, but her meticulous charts and X-ray images had undeniable impact on elite opinion. As lantern light flickers, you follow a small delegation to the Legislative Assembly, where 3 male deputies and 2 female delegates submit the Foot-Binding Prohibition Act. In early 1912, the law proposes fines in community service for parents who fail to prevent daughters binding. A mainstream fact. While provincial laws criminalizing binding emerged by 1915, enforcement varied widely and loopholes abounded. Historians still argue whether legal prohibition or shifting social norms primarily ended binding, likely both intertwined. But standing in the hall, you feel the weight of history tipping. Finally, you return to the quiet of your own bed, slippers tossed aside, linens fresh and untainted by binding paste. Reflect on the chorus of voices, Kyujin's fiery poems, missionary fundraisers, evening classes, petition signing students, legislative debates, and clinical lectures. Each movementalist or grassroots, foreign-backed or nationalistic, pulled at the fabric of tradition until it unraveled. Historians still argue whether the anti-binding movement's victory belonged to women reclaiming autonomy or to the broader push for national rejuvenation in a crumbling empire. Let that unresolved question settle like dust motes in the lamplit room, drifting as softly as unbound feet returning to earth. As the fan hums its rhythmic counterpoint, allow the echoes of reform chants and lantern-lit processions to fade into a lullaby of progress, and drift into rest, knowing that centuries of constraint learn to loosen, one binding at a time. You awaken to the soft click of a needle against silk, a delicate sound recalling the grand embroidery workshops of Section 9 and the secret codes of Section 14. But tonight, you're in the quiet aftermath of a tradition abolished, watching former binders transform their skills into peaceful needlework. Imagine a sunlit attic room in 1920s Guangzhou. Low wooden benches arranged around a wide oak table strewn with silk threads and colorful hoops. The air is warm with dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun, punctuated by the gentle hum of a ceiling fan and the whisper of silk sliding through fingers. A mainstream fact. After foot binding was officially outlawed in 1915, many women who had bound feet struggled to find new livelihoods. Embroidery schools sprang up across southern China, teaching former binders to apply their expertise to decorative arts. Historians still argue whether these schools genuinely empowered women economically or simply channeled them into traditional female roles. But the shift from constricting cloth to free-flowing thread marks a profound transformation in both skill and identity. You sit among a circle of elderly sisters, each with ankles still bearing the ghostly ridges of bindings. Their lotus feet are now unwrapped, but the arches remain permanently high, their toes crooked from years of compression. A fringe account notes that some women used special orthopedic sandals, wooden-soled, leather-strapped, to ease their first steps unbound. But you're more intrigued by the quiet determination on their faces as they thread needles. In the center, a former binder named Auntie May guides the group through a new pattern, peony and pomegranate motifs embroidered on silk panels destined for bridal trousseaux. You recall the fertility symbolism of pomegranates from Section 6. Here, these same Symbols represent life's renewal after binding's end. A quirky detail may insist on using a single strand of gold thread in each motif, claiming it heals the stitcher's spirit by linking her past pain to a brighter future. You half smile, imagining each loop of gold thread carrying a whisper of resilience. As you dip your thread into a dish of rosewater, you glance around the room. The walls display apprentices' work, silk pillows stitched with lotus blossoms, table runners adorned with bamboo sways, and even modern marathon banners inviting villagers to run barefoot. A mainstream fact: Embroidery Guild records from the 1920s show a 40% increase in orders for non-traditional items, household linens, fashion accessories, and public banners suggesting former binders found diverse markets for their art. Historians still debate whether these expansions broke women out of domestic confines or simply repackaged their labor for new female-appropriate industries. But you sense a spark of agency in each evolving design. Auntie May beckons you closer. She hands you a pair of bamboo embroidery hoops holding half-finished lotus hue appliques. Finish this, she urges, and you'll preserve the memory of our past in every stitch. You pinch dried persimmon gum from a small dish and apply it to the silk before smoothing your thread. The surface shimmers under your fingertip, a tactile reminder of silk's journey from roads to workshops to this quiet attic. As you work, May quietly recounts how their first orders came from patriotic societies eager to commemorate the practice's abolition. In one case, a Shanghai museum commissioned silk panels illustrating the story of binding and unbinding, each square representing a decade of binding history. A mainstream fact: early museum patronage of embroidery schools provided seed funding that allowed dozens of these guilds to survive the Great Depression. Historians still argue whether this support was altruistic or a form of cultural preservation motivated by nationalism. But the collaboration between artisans and institutions undeniably gave these women a platform. Between stitches, you hear the others share personal stories. One woman describes teaching her granddaughter the Release Me stitch from section 14, passing along both technique and coded heritage. Another talks of a buyer in Europe who paid handsomely for embroidered slippers as novelty soup. Reminder that lotus feet art continued to fascinate foreign imaginations. You smile. It seems the world still thirsted for lotus lore, albeit as a curiosity rather than a status symbol. Auntie May demonstrates a new style, embroidering floral motifs on silk face masks designed to protect against dust and pollen. You flick your gaze to the modern mask hanging by the window, a simple rectangle of white silk with pastel peonies dancing across its surface. A quirky tidbit: some customers requested hidden silk messages woven into the mask's interior, echoing the secret codes of old lotus shoes, a final nod to coded resistance even in new forms. You trace the invisible stitches, marveling at the persistence of cipher beneath every layer of fabric. The afternoon sun dips lower, painting the attic in warm amber tones. You lift your head to admire a large wall banner reading From Binding to Blooming, its characters painted in flowing calligraphy surrounded by embroidered lotus petals. A mainstream fact: guild advertisements of the era often use slogans linking the end of foot binding to cultural renewal, tapping into widespread desires for modernization. Scholars still debate whether these slogans truly reflected grassroots sentiment or were marketing ploys, but the banner's hopeful message feels genuine in this room, filled with women's laughter and needle chatter. You finish your app, tying off the thread with a neat French knot. May inspects your work and nods approvingly. Each stitch honors the past, she says softly, her voice carrying the wisdom of decades. She gestures to a framed photograph of the first embroidery school women in tightly bound feet. Group portraits with solemn expressions juxtaposed with a modern photo of the same women, 2 decades older, their feet free and their hands busy with needlework. The contrast is striking. Where once silence reigned, now the room resonates with shared purpose. As the fan hums and dusk settles, you gather your finished panel and tuck it into a cloth satchel embroidered with crane symbols of longevity, now repurposed for unbinding. You recall the cranes from Section 6, now freed from the constraints of roped toes to soar across civic banners and bridal gowns alike. The entire room seems to breathe with renewal, from forced confinement to chosen creativity. These women rewrote their narratives in silk. Before you leave, Auntie May places a small silk pouch in your hand. It's stitched with bamboo leaves and discreet whisper spiral motifs, a gift for your participation. She smiles. Carry our story with you. You cradle the pouch, feeling both the weight of history and the lightness of transformed purpose. As you descend the attic stairs, let the quiet click of needles echo in your mind, a lullaby of resilience spun from trauma and artistry. Historians still argue whether this transition to decorative embroidery constituted true liberation or simply a shift in form. But tonight, in this sunlit room, every stitch feels like freedom. Allow the image of bound feet turned busy hands to guide your thoughts, beauty and pain repurposed into art, constraint untangled into creativity. And as you close the door, let the gentle hum of silk and thread carry you toward rest. Each loop of needlework a tender whisper of renewal. You awaken in a hushed gallery lit by soft spotlights that mimic lantern glow. Remember the silk slippers arrayed before you in Section 6 and the bamboo-bound village shoes from Section 8. Tonight you're touring a modern museum devoted to lotus shoes, where each glass case holds an echo of bone and fabric, and every exhibit whispers stories stitched into history's margins. You step onto a pale gray floor engraved with a winding lotus petal motif, guiding you past the entrance. Plaque, Footbinding Heritage Museum. Established 2005, a mainstream fact, the National Silk Museum in Hangzhou houses over 200 pairs of lotus shoes spanning the Song to Qing dynasties, making it one of the largest public collections worldwide. Historians still argue whether showcasing these shoes emphasizes craftsmanship over suffering or risks, aestheticizing a painful tradition, and you probably won't survive the tension of admiring beauty carved from agony. But here both coexist under gentle lighting. Gliding past the introductory panels, you catch sight of a diorama recreating a chiniera embroidery workshop complete with wax thread spools and half-finished shoes, recalling the attic school scene in Section 17. A quirky tidbit: the museum's curator once installed hidden sensors that play a faint click-click audio track whenever visitors approach the embroidery station, as if the shoes themselves still tap across marble floors. You chuckle softly, ambient torture sound effects. But there's a strangely soothing rhythm to those echoes, like a metronome guiding you deeper into history. In the central hall, rows of lotus shoes rest on pedestals, each labeled by date, region, and design motif. You lean in to examine a pair of Mingara ivory-inlaid slippers, tiny wheels of bone, tucked beneath silk remembering the ivory wedges under the grandmother's coils in Section 4. A mainstream fact, these mid-Qing ivory-lined shoes were often gifts to brides of the imperial clan, signifying both wealth and rank. Scholars still debate whether ivory uses were purely functional or deliberate status displays, but you can almost feel the chilly smoothness of bone under your fingertip. Alongside, a touchscreen station invites you to explore oral histories recorded by the museum team. You press play and hear the voice of Mrs. Zhang, a former binder in her 80s, recounting how she learned binding knots from her grandmother by moonlight, just like the midnight bindings hidden among villagers of Section 8. Her tone is soft, the Cantonese syllables curling like silk threads. I remember the ache, yes, but also the pride. I felt like part of something greater. A scholarly debate phrase drifts through your mind. Historians still argue whether such memories reflect genuine affection for tradition or adaptive nostalgia shaped by cultural amnesia. You wander into a side gallery where modern art meets memory. Floor-to-ceiling panels display photographs of lotus shoes framed next to black and white portraits of the women who wore them. One striking image shows a young woman in 1930s Shanghai, perched on a chair to expose her bound feet for a photographer, eyes fierce with defiance despite the pain. A fringe tidbit notes that photographer Liang Xinyu secretly used infrared film to capture skin scars and binding lines more visibly, a precursor to medical imaging that revealed injuries hidden beneath silk. You wince at the invasive detail, yet admire her courage in making pain visible. Next, you discover the embroidered voices installation, translucent silk curtains, embroidered with whispered quotes from binders and reformers alike. You lean closer, your fingertips brushing but not touching the delicate threads. I stitched my sorrows into peonies. Unbinding my feet was like waking from a dream. You recall the secret codes in Section 14 that release me. Bars and whispers, spirals, and sense how embroidery became both subversion and solace. Historians still argue whether such artful flourishes materially aided resistance or simply offered emotional refuge. But in this hall they swirl around you like incensed smoke. A soft voice from a guide floats through the space, describing the rural shoe exhibit course, hemp slippers stitched with roosters and grain sheaves, much like the folk shoes May wore in Section 8. You step into a reconstructed peasant home. Low beams overhead and earthen floors underfoot, where these rustic shoes sit beside wooden wedges and mint paste jars. A mainstream fact, anthropological surveys from the 1960s recovered over 500 pairs of folk lotus shoes in Jiangxi province alone, indicating the custom's deep rural roots. Scholars still debate whether these practical versions reflected peasant ingenuity or desperate social mimicry, but here they stand as testimony to binding's reach across class lines. You drift into the multimedia room, where a 10-minute video loops scenes of former binders visiting the museum. One woman, her face lined with age, lifts a delicate Song-era slipper with reverence, eyes misting as she recalls her own bindings. You watch her gently trace a peony stitch, imagining the thousands of times her fingers performed similar loops. In Embroidery School, Section 17, a quirky detail, the museum outfitted this room with low benches curving like lotus petals, so visitors instinctively adopt a kneeling posture, emulating the reverence of traditional footbinding ceremonies. You settle into the curve, feeling as if you've been invited into a secret sisterhood. In a quiet corner, the VR Lotus Walk experience beckons. You slip on lightweight goggles and headphones. Suddenly you're in a simulated Qing palace corridor, delicate slippers on your bound feet, silk hems brushing lacquerwood as you take halting steps. The audio track pulses with soft chants and chamber music perhaps borrowed from the rituals in Section 3. You yelp as your virtual foot catches on an imaginary threshold, a reminder that even simulations can't fully erase the practices. Perilous awkwardness. Stepping out, you pass a display case of museum-conserved embroidery tools, ivory needles, sandalwood bobbins, camphor-stained cotton pads. A mainstream fact. Conservation records show that preserving these organic materials demands climate control at 50% humidity and 20 degrees Celsius to prevent mold and fiber decay. Historians still argue whether prioritizing artifact preservation best honors the women who made these items or risks turning their handmade objects into static relics, museum taxidermy rather than living culture. You shiver at the thought of embalmed silk. Before you leave, you encounter the Memory Quilt Project, a 20-foot tapestry pieced together from donated cloth scraps, lotus shoe fragments, and handwritten letters. Each square carries a personal story. One reads, "My grandmother danced on bound feet for the emperor," and another, "I unbound my sister's shoes in secret at dawn." A quirky tidbit, the quilt's final square was stitched by a group of children in Beijing who had no ancestral binding. They embroidered theirs with sneakers and unicorn symbols of modern freedom woven into the legacy's end. You smile, touched by their innocence stitching hope into the past. As you approach the exit, the museum's parting gift awaits, a small sachet of dried lotus petals and mint leaves. Echoing the cleansing baths of Section 10, you cradle the fragrant pouch in your palm, feeling the soft weight of collective memory pressed into cloth. Historians still argue whether museums preserve foot-binding heritage as a cautionary tale or celebrate it as cultural artistry. But tonight, you carry both truths in your pocket. Stepping back into the night, the gallery's lotus petal floor beneath your feet feels both solid and ephemeral. You breathe in the cool air, recalling lantern-lit workshops, rural courtyards, and imperial decrees. Allow the museum's flickering displays, the click of censers, the hush of silk curtains, and the virtual clatter of bound feet to blend into your dreams. Let the voices of Mrs. Zhang and the Beijing children mingle as you drift, a symphony of sorrow, resilience, art, and renewal. You awaken to the crisp click of high-fashion heels on polished concrete, a far cry from bamboo wedges and lacquered floors of earlier chapters, and find yourself backstage at Shanghai Fashion Week, where modern designers revive lotus foot motifs in daring runway creations. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit workroom, bolts of silk and organza piled high, neon sketches of miniature shoe shapes pinned to walls, and the hum of sewing machines mingling with muffled Vogue playlist beats. A mainstream fact. Over the past decade, designers such as Guo Pei and Zhang Zhao have incorporated lotus shoe embroidery and binding-inspired silhouettes into couture collections, earning critical acclaim at Paris and Milan shows. Historians still argue whether these references celebrate cultural heritage or risk fetishizing painful traditions, and you probably won't survive picturing a model teetering down a runway in 3-inch heel lotus foot boots. But here, history and haute couture collide. You slip into a tailoring bay where artisans translate one-to-one lotus shoe patterns into avant-garde footwear. They used 3D printing for soles mimicking bone-arched curves, layered with hand-embroidered silk petals echoing the peony and pomegranate motifs you saw in Section 6 and Section 17. A quirky detail, some ateliers mix biodegradable pla filament with crushed lotus leaf extract, believing it lends an eco-friendly fragrance, and fine green threads that biodegrade post. You wrinkle your nose at the plantain-fused plastic, but admit the concept fuses tradition and sustainability in a marriage as unlikely as lotus shoes on solar-powered platforms. Behind a glass partition, you watch pattern makers drape translucent chiffon over foot mannequins, crafting binding-like straps that coil upward like ribboned sculptures. There's the neo-lotus binding line, straps tight enough to suggest compression, yet flexible enough for comfort. A mainstream fact. Modern biomechanics studies guided these designs, ensuring arch support and even weight distribution to avoid the health issues chronicled in Section 15. Scholars still debate whether these functional motifs trivialize real suffering or repurpose history for positive innovation, but the fitted sandals look almost beautiful, a silent homage to centuries-old artistry. You wander into the showroom where models prep under heat lamps, their feet clad in clear plexiglass slippers etched with subtle embroidery codes from Section 14. Each slipper bears a tiny "Release Me" bar motif on the insole, legible only when lifted or peered at closely. Fringe fashion bloggers praise these hidden messages as micro-rebellions, while academic commentators question whether such nods count as responsible storytelling or mere marketing gimmicks. You lean in, tracing the bar's faint lines, imagining how it might feel to find a secret plea beneath your sole. Across the room, a rising designer named Lian Wei debuts her Lotus Spectrum dress, a floor-length garment embroidered with a gradient of lotus motifs, from pale pastels at the hem to vivid crimson near the bodice. Each lotus is stitched with modern metallic threads, subtle nods to the alloy embroidery once used by palace artisans. Section 6. A mainstream fact. Lian 2019 collection sold out within hours in Beijing boutiques, signaling public enthusiasm for heritage-inspired fashion. Historians still argue whether this trend reflects genuine cultural reclamation or the allure of exoticism for global audiences. But the sales figures speak volumes. You slide backstage, catching a glimpse of models practicing their lotus walk, stylized gait, taught by choreographers who studied Binanera tutorials. They angle their feet outward, knees slightly bent, balancing on minimal heel surface. A quirky tidbit: choreographers collaborated with former ballet dancers to adapt plies into lotus step sequences, ensuring safety while preserving historical posture. You almost giggle, picturing Ballet Lotus Fusion class teased as Topwent Heritage Edition. But the elegance is undeniable. Turning a corner, you find a collaborative pop-up shop where artisans from the embroidery schools in Section 17 sell limited edition accessories. Silk headbands woven with checkerboard patience patterns, whisper spiral brooches, and tiny hangable lotus hue charms. Proceed support former binders teaching embroidery to disabled veterans, a modern twist on communal support networks. A mainstream fact: social enterprises like Stitch for Change reported a 25% income increase for guild members. In 2024, scholars still debate whether commercializing heritage empowers artisans or commodifies cultural trauma. But you're heartened by the tangible impact at the show's bar. You sip an iris-infused cocktail called Free Arch, garnished with a candied lotus petal from Gyeongnan. The bartender explains that the flavor profile blends bitter and sweet notes, symbolizing pain transmuted into beauty. You savor the drink's layered complexity, floral resonance, lightly tartaned. Note how sensory experiences anchor historical narratives in the present. You stroll through a virtual reality installation adjacent to the runway, where viewers don headsets to walk a simulated marketplace of modern lotus-inspired designs. Digital projections map how embroidery codes evolved from the release me bars and phoenix feathers of Section 14 to swirling pixelated motifs in 4000 resolution. Fringe tech watchers hail it as wearable metadata, while purists warn it's atavistic fetishes. You hesitate, but slip on the headset, trading tactile silk for streaming pixels, and feel the immersive loop of history repeating through innovation. Nearby, a panel discussion begins: couture and cultural memory. Experts debate whether referencing foot binding in fashion fosters historical education or trivializes real trauma. A mainstream fact: UNESCO recognized lotus shoe craft in 2012 as intangible cultural heritage, spurring both preservation and tourism. Historians still argue whether UNESCO listings diluted local narratives into global souvenirs or safeguarded disappearing techniques. Either view woven into the broader tapestry of heritage management. As the runway clears, you linger by a final exhibit, a glass case housing a pair of transparent heels, filled with preserved lotus-based residue and bone fragments, the actual binding materials suspended in resin. A fringe commentary from avant-garde critics praises it as the ultimate tribute, while ethical scholars balk at displaying human remains in fashion contexts. You stare at the suspended fragments, simultaneously repulsive and mesmerizing, and feel the convergence of art, commerce, and memory coalesce in that single artifact. You exit the venue into neon-lit streets, silk chiffon fluttering in the evening breeze. Recall the ivory rulers, rural bamboo wedges, and imperial decreasal ancestral inputs fueling these modern revivals. Let the surreal blend of LEDs and silk threads guide you. A runway where past pain becomes runway power, where embroidery codes flicker like digital memes, and where every touched strap echoes centuries of constrained beauty. Historians still argue whether these modern homages honor or exploit foot binding's legacy. But tonight, you walked the line between tribute and transformation. Allow the flash of photographers' bulbs and the hush of silk gowns to dissolve in your mind, shaping a lullaby of innovation spun from historical threads. And as the city hums its electric lullaby, drift toward rest, knowing that even ancient constraints can inspire new creations, flowers blooming in unexpected places. You awake to the faint patter of summer rain against your window pane, its soft rhythm merging with the distant hum of your bedside fan, recalling the electric runway lights and silk chiffon breeze from Section 19. Tonight's journey drifts toward a final reflection, a gentle fade that mingles all the threads you've followed: imperial courts and peasant huts, secret embroidery codes and multinational reform movements, cutting-edge couture and museum dioramas. Imagine yourself lying back on a plush cushion, the accumulated weight of centuries settling like dew on lotus petals, each drop refracting the vast tapestry of history you've traversed. Your mind drifts first to those earliest echoes in song, China, the ritual ceremonies and herbal poultices of Sections 3 and 4, where girls barely 7 felt bone and cloth conspire against them. You remember the hush of jasmine incense, the grandmother's steady hands wrapping each tapering arch, and the poetic myth of the dancer Panjinlian tapping petals across court marble. In that formative moment, a tradition took root whose fragile constraints would ripple for generations. Now, in this final moment, you sense how that single click of cloth set in motion entire empire's obsessions. Slowly, You recall the myths and literary scenes of Section 12, scrolls of verse praising lotus petals unfolding on jade floors, yuan scripts layering stagecraft over lived pain, and folk ballads warning tender girls of fractured youth. Those words, so elegantly hushed, became part of the cultural chorus that both celebrated and critiqued beauty's heavy toll. Here in the hush of your room, let their poetic warnings and wistful praise settle into the corners of your mind, where they become lullabies and admonitions at once. Next, your thoughts drift to the edicts and imprimaturs of Section 13, half-hearted Ban 60's dramatic decrees, and the final Republican outlawing that criminalized bindings under penalty of law. You envision court scribes hunched over zittonwood desks, magistrates erecting measuring stations beneath carved pillars, and the last imperial orders echo fading through forbidden city corridors. Those legal efforts strove to tear at the seams of a thousand-year tradition, but often they only frayed its edges. Now, you sense how law and custom wove a complex fabric, each ruling tugging a thread of social expectation until the whole pattern unraveled. Your mind drifts onward to the spirited reformers of Section 16, Kyujin brandishing lotus shoes aflame, students printing subversive cartoons in tea caddies, and lantern processions winding through the French concession. You hear the rally cries, "Unbind for freedom," and feel the heady thrill of collective hope as women discovered agency and solidarity. Their petitions, classrooms, and political theater ignited the spark that law alone could not. Here, in your quiet sanctuary, the echo of their chants persists, reminding you that progress often emerges not from decree but from shared resolve. Now the scene shifts to the embroidery schools and atelier tables of Section 17, formerly bound feet, now free, fingers nimble with gold thread and rosewater gum, each stitch a reclamation of identity. You envision Auntie May guiding apprentices, the steam of jasmine baths lingering in your nose, and the tapestry of personal renewal unfolding in sunlit attics. That metamorphosis from forced constraint to chosen artistry speaks to the resilience of women who turned pain into creativity. As you sink deeper into your pillow, let their quiet dignity infuse your dreams. You turn toward the museum galleries of Section 18, the silent rows of lotus shoes under spotlights, the ambient click-track evoking vanished footsteps, the memory quilt patchworked with voices old and new. In that hushed space, beauty and agony preside side by side, preserved in glass and digitized in VR. Even here, tradition resists simple narrative. Museums both immortalize and distance, reminding you that memory can be as constraining as cloth binds itself. Now, rest in the gentle hush of memory's cathedral, where whispers of silk and bone harmonize from the museum. You step through the virtual corridor into the neon-lit streets of the Fashion Week finale. In Section 19, runway models, in 3D printed lotus soles, eco-friendly plow with lotus leaf fragrance, and the ultimate glass-encased resin heels preserving fragments of paste and bone. Designers and critics spar over homage versus exploitation, weaving modern commerce into the old narrative. The industry's flash and fade remind you that cultural symbols persist, repurposed in new contexts, ever straddling the line between tribute and commodification. Let that tension ease as you exhale, recognizing the paradox that sometimes the harshest histories yield the brightest innovations. And now, in this final section, you reflect on the countless women whose lives intersected with this custom. The anxious 3-year-olds in opium-laced sleep tea, the middle-aged artisans coaxing silk through needles, the reformist students clutching pamphlets under gaslight, and the aged survivors tracing scars beneath museum spotlights. Each story so divergent threads together into an intricate tapestry, woven from control and choice, oppression and artistry. As you lie here, allow the weight of their lived experiences to settle. Carrying both sorrow and triumph, your pillow cradles your head, soft beneath the accumulated centuries, and you sense the cyclical nature of beauty and power. The story of footbinding began with a desire for aesthetic grace and ended with a collective yearning for autonomy. Between those endpoints lie myths, rituals, revolts, stitches, and statutes, a labyrinth of human agency. Now, let that labyrinth unwind, each corridor dissolving into a gentle expanse of quiet understanding. Now, let your breath slow, sinking with the rain's soft patter and the fan's steady counterpoint. Remember the click of silk slippers, the hush of secret codes, the crackle of embers under revolutionary shoes, and the whisper of needles dancing through silk. All these echoes blend into a lullaby more compelling than any single note, a lullaby of transformation, resilience, and gentle release. The rain's quiet rhythm softens your thoughts as you drift, each drop echoing the click of silk bindings. Loosening at last, feel the gentle wash of cool water against your cheeks, as if the world's collective tears have been released, leaving only calm. Let your muscles unravel, starting from your toes freed from tiny shoes and flowing upward, with the water's path. Imagine each breath as a soft exhale of regret, each inhale a renewal of quiet hope. Envision the lotus petals you once saw embroidered on tiny slippers now floating on a tranquil pond. No bindings keep them in place. They drift freely on glassy, Water, turning in circles as though dancing without constraint. You, too, can drift like those petals, weightless and unbound, carried where gentle currents will carry you. Feel the centuries of stories of pain, protest, and art. From your shoulders like a silk robe shed at twilight, the myths and edicts, the secret stitches and blazing protests, the modern revivals and museum showcases all become soft memories, like distant lanterns fading into dawn. Allow them to slip into the background, leaving the hush of possibility in their wake. As your mind quiets, rest in the knowledge that even the most restrictive legacies can transform into art, advocacy, and renewal. Let this be your last thought, that every constraint can become a catalyst, every sorrow a stitch, in a grander design of beauty and resilience. Now, inhale deeply once more, exhale fully, and surrender to the gentle embrace of sleep.